Mesdames et messieurs, bonjour. Mesdames et messieurs, bonjour. Quelques mots sur cette réunion du Conseil de sécurité, puisque le Conseil de sécurité se réunit aujourd'hui en présence du président Zelenskiy, alors que la Russie mène une guerre d'agression contre l'Ukraine depuis 18 mois. C'est une guerre contre un pays souverain, mais c'est aussi une guerre contre les principes fondamentaux de la Charte des Nations Unies, au premier rang desquels la souveraineté et l'intégrité territoriale des États. Mais je voudrais insister sur ce point. Cette guerre est une guerre contre les principes qui fondent notre sécurité collective. C'est aussi une guerre contre tous les pays qui souffrent de l'insécurité alimentaire que la Russie aggrave volontairement. Car c'est la Russie, et la Russie seule, qui bloque la mer Noire. C'est la Russie qui détruit les infrastructures portuaires en Ukraine et qui détruit des centaines de milliers de tonnes de céréales. Alors je redirai à l'occasion de cette réunion du Conseil de sécurité notre détermination à mettre cette agression en échec, car si nous la laissions réussir, ce seraient d'autres agressions qui se produiraient là ou ailleurs. Nous aiderons l'Ukraine, vous le savez, aussi longtemps qu'il le faudra, en lui donnant les moyens de se défendre et les moyens de se reconstruire. Nous nous assurerons que la Russie rende des comptes pour les crimes qu'elle commet en Ukraine. Nous soutiendrons aussi la préservation de la sûreté des centrales nucléaires civiles ukrainiennes menacées par l'occupation russe. Nous maintiendrons notre action de solidarité au bénéfice des pays que les actions russes fragilisent sur le plan de la sécurité alimentaire. Et enfin, nous aiderons l'Ukraine à faire valoir la vision pour la paix que porte le président Zelenskiy, car voyez bien que l'Ukraine, même agressée, est là seule à proposer un plan de paix. Elle est prête à travailler avec tous les pays de bonne volonté qui, comme nous, veulent défendre la Charte des Nations Unies, la paix et la sécurité internationale. Je vous remercie.
Thank you very much, Madam Minister. Edith Lederer from the Associated Press. There's been another conflict taking place this week in Europe. Azerbaijan launched an offensive against Armenian positions in Nagorno-Karabakh. There's been a ceasefire declared, but how serious is this for Europe and for France?
Thank you for your question. I'll answer in French, if I may, if you allow me to do so. Dès hier, Madame, la France a condamné l'offensive militaire russe, pardonnez-moi, que mène l'Azerbaïdjan au Haut-Karabakh. Dès hier, la France a condamné l'offensive militaire menée par l'Azerbaïdjan au Haut-Karabakh. Il y a, vous le dites, des victimes civiles, comme nous le craignons. Un cessez-le-feu, en effet, semble avoir été établi. Nous verrons si c'est bien le cas. Je voudrais surtout insister sur une perspective plus large. La France a toujours soutenu et soutient une solution négociée, garantissant aux populations arméniennes du Haut-Karabakh leur droit à vivre en paix, dans le respect de leur histoire, dans le respect de leur culture. Et bien sûr, cette garantie ne peut pas résulter d'un diktat. Nous tenons, je l'ai dit hier, mais je le répète, nous tenons l'Azerbaïdjan pour responsable du sort des populations. Et enfin, les informations qui nous parviennent faisant état d'un possible exode de ces populations sont extrêmement préoccupants. Et pour conclure, je voudrais dire aussi mon inquiétude face à la rhétorique mensongère qui peut viser à entraîner l'Arménie dans des événements tragiques. Nous resterons très vigilants à toute tentative de prendre au prétexte les événements en cours pour mettre en cause l'intégrité territoriale de l'Arménie. Et voilà donc la raison pour laquelle, Madame, il est important que le Conseil de sécurité fasse entendre une voix unie et claire sur tous ces sujets. Je vous remercie.
Able to go to school in Afghanistan. Do you think the international community needs to take a more concrete step towards rights in Afghanistan?
We do care about this awful issue. We do act, as a nation, as France tries to do very visibly.
The 9,421st meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is maintenance of international peace and security, upholding the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter through effective multilateralism, maintenance of peace and security of Ukraine. The agenda is adopted. I would like to warmly welcome the Secretary General, distinguished presidents, prime ministers, ministers, and other high-level representatives present in the Security Council chamber. Your presence today underscores the importance of the subject matter under discussion. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite representatives of Argentina, Australia, Austria, Belarus, Belgium, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Bulgaria, Canada, Chile, Croatia, Czechia, Denmark, Estonia, Germany, Greece, Guatemala, Hungary, India, Indonesia, Ireland, Italy, Kuwait, Latvia, Liechtenstein, Lithuania, Mexico, Montenegro, the Kingdom of the Netherlands, North Macedonia, Panama, Poland, Portugal, Qatar, the Republic of Korea, Romania, Sierra Leone, Slovakia, Slovenia, South Africa, Spain, Turkey, Ukraine, and the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela to participate in the meeting. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I also invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. His Excellency Mr. Charles Michel, President of the European Council. His Excellency Mr. Bujar Osmani, Chairperson in Office of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And His Excellency Grand Chancellor Riccardo Paterno di Montecupo, Sovereign Order of Malta. It is so decided. I also propose that the Council invite His Excellency Archbishop Paul Richard Gallagher, Secretary for Relations with States and International Organizations of the Holy See, to participate in the meeting, in accordance with the Provisional Rules of Procedure and the previous practice in this regard. There being no objection, it is so decided. The delegation of Russian Federation has asked for the floor. Please, you have the floor.
Mr. President, you were hasty in saying the words, "it is so decided." We had two questions. First and foremost, we wish to ask you on what basis you propose to give the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelenskiy, the floor before members of the Security Council speak, many of whom also are represented at the level of heads of state and government. And my second question, the second question I wish to pose, is on what basis are you inviting the Minister for Foreign Affairs of North Macedonia to today's meeting in the capacity as the chair of the OSCE?
So I take note of the remarks made by the Russian delegation, and in response, I would like to confirm that notice of the speaking order was given to all Council members in advance, and in my view, it would have been preferable had this procedural matter been resolved at a technical level prior to the start of this open debate, so that we would have been able to proceed immediately to the substance of our deliberations today. I wish to recall that paragraph 33 of Presidential Note S 2017-507, agreed by consensus, states, and I quote, "When non-members are invited to speak to the Security Council, those who have a direct interest in the outcome of the matter under consideration may speak prior to Council members if appropriate." End of quote. Given the subject of today's open debate, we believe that inviting President Zelensky to speak before Council members amply confirms to paragraph 33. Moreover, giving the floor first to President Zelensky will provide the opportunity for Council members and the other member states participating today in such impressive numbers to respond to his remarks. Previously, in February of this year, the Russian delegation raised the same issue and was assured by then the Council President that ample precedents exist of non-Council member states taking the floor before Council members. Several cases were cited at that time, and others could be mentioned. I would add that at each of the previous 5 Security Council meetings in which President Zelensky was invited to participate, he spoke before Council members. I want to assure our Russian colleagues and everyone here that this is not a special operation by the Albanian presidency, but a continuation of a long and well-established practice of this Council, and today's speaking order therefore is in full conformity with the Council's guidelines and practices. As for the second question, I have a certain difficulty to understand what's the problem, because OSCE has an important role and is here because of its contribution to this meeting considered of essence. Yes, the OSCE representative here is an Albanian from North Macedonia, but if you would be more explicit what's the problem, I would be happy to help you.
With pleasure, Mr. President. We do not believe that the arguments that you have advanced are compelling. There are a number of members of the Security Council that will be represented in the hall today at the head of state level. You tried to explain why the Ukrainian president is being prioritized. However, the procedure, this has nothing to do with the procedure for the Security Council. You can understand the logic. When we discussed Somalia here, the president of Somalia spoke first here, but he was the only president from among those present. There are indeed precedents related to other files on the Security Council's agenda, but a specific practice has unfolded linked to the specificities of certain regions, which has nothing to do with the situation in Ukraine. I would like to warn you that if today you bang the gavel thereby implementing your decision, the Albanian presidency will be tainted with an egregious precedent of violating existing practice in the Security Council, established practice for the benefit of one delegation, which time after time continues to demonstrate with support from the West that their rules don't apply to it and everything is permissible. From the beginning, Western members of the Security Council 3 times pushed through the participation of Volodymyr Zelenskiy in Security Council meetings through video link. This constitutes a blatant disregard for the authority of this key body. Other states find time in their schedule to travel in person to New York and to speak before the members of the Security Council. Over the course of the 75 years of the existence of the organization, the emergence and presence at the Security Council, speaking before the Council, was viewed to be a privilege. The same applies to statements from the lofty tribune of the General Assembly. Instead of which, during the last session, during the special session, the representative of Kiev decided to speak through video link. At the same time, Western delegations alleged that last year Volodymyr Zelenskiy was unable to leave the country due to extraordinary circumstances. These circumstances, nonetheless, did not prevent him from traveling to the U.S. to visit Washington, and yet he did not deign at the time to travel personally to the United Nations. Colleagues, consider the violation of the president by the president of the practice of the work of the Security Council is fraught with risks of undermining the authority of the Security Council, which they are trying to transform into a one-man stand-up show. And for this, the Albanian presidency convened an open debate. In this debate, a large group of supporters from among NATO countries, and it is clear for many, at least for most, that today's meeting is will be nothing more than a spectacle. I would like to stress for protocol and for those who are trying to distort our position, we do not object to the participation of the Ukrainian president in this meeting. But this needs to be done in line with the rules of procedure and existing practice, according to which countries invited under Rule 37 speak after the members of the Security Council, especially when, as both members of the Council and a number of other representatives under Rule 37 are represented at the head of state and government level. Turning to the participation of the Albanian Foreign Minister and of North Macedonia, apologizes the Speaker, as a current chairperson in office of the OSCE. Our being appalled at this has nothing to do with his nationality, sir, and we objected to his presence in this capacity, and we informed the Albanian presidency about this yesterday. we fail to understand. As far as we understand, there has been no discussion of this or any open discussion of at the building or in Vienna, the headquarters. There was no discussion. According to approved principles by the Permanent Council of the OSCE, any statements of chairperson in office, the Secretary General of the OSCE, or official representatives authorized by them need to be in line with their mandates, and they must not depart from the consensual position of the OSCE. If the Albanian presidency insists on allowing Mr. Osmani to speak during today's meeting, we believe that he can voice only the consensual position of this organization. I would note separately that the OSCE, due to the destructive approach adopted by Western delegations, has long not been in any way contributing to the process of resolving the Ukrainian crisis, but it has only been exacerbating the situation. We see this in attempts to advance and push through in a way that runs counter to practice. Mr. Osmani's participation by Western delegations, their attempt to advance one-sided rules of the game as part of the rules-based order. We urge members of the Security Council to adopt a principled position in this issue and to speak out against such approaches. We regret that the Albanian presidency has demonstrated blatant disregard for consensus and practices of the Security Council. They have placed their NATO political and ideological beliefs above the obligations of the Presidency of the Security Council, which is a guardian for the procedures and should adopt an impartial position. Unfortunately, the Albania has been unable to manage this today. Thank you.
I must say that coming from you, all this lecture of violating the rules in this building is quite an impressive shoot. But as far as you repeated many times that the violation here is about President Zelensky speaking before the Council members, there is a solution for this if you agree. You stop the war and President Zelensky will not take the floor. So what made him here important and what makes important for all of us to hear him first and then discuss is made from you, not from us. Thank you very much. I take note and we'll continue with our session. You want the floor again? Okay.
Mr. President, I wish to draw your attention to the fact that you today are acting as President of the Security Council, not speaking in your national capacity as a representative of Albania. Your objective is to conduct a meeting as is enshrined in the rules of procedure of the Security Council instead of providing political assessments in your capacity as the President of the Security Council. Thank you.
I just responded to you after you addressing me as the Albanian Prime Minister and after you continuing to say incorrect things about what the procedure is here. If you don't want me to answer as an Albanian Prime Minister, don't provoke me as such. Anyhow, let's keep going now. The security, again, okay?
Mr. President, I turn to you only as the President of the Security Council. Not once did I turn to you as the Prime Minister of Albania. Once again, I stress, I'm engaged in a procedural dialogue with you, not in a substantive dialogue. Please refrain from political assessments at the beginning of your statement at the Council.
Yeah, it was you that talked about NATO, about Albania being in NATO, about NATO countries coming here, so all this has nothing to do with my role as President of the Council. Anyhow, can we now, with your permission, continue normally the session? Thank you very much. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of agenda. I wish to draw the attention of Council members to document S2023/65/3, a letter dated 6 September 2023 from the Permanent Representative of Albania to the United Nations addressed to the President of the Security Council. I now give the floor to the Secretary General, His Excellency Mr. Antonio Gutierrez.
Mr. President, Excellencies, the United Nations Charter is our roadmap to a more peaceful world. The tools and mechanisms founded on the principles of the Charter are a how-to manual to resolve conflict. Together, our collective efforts over the years have contributed to preventing war on a global scale and saving millions of lives through peacemaking and preventing diplomacy, UN peacekeeping operations, disarmament and non-proliferation efforts, humanitarian and development programs, and activities to promote human rights.
Just this week, the Sustainable Development Goals Summit agreed a rescue plan for the SDGs, an essential tool to prevent conflicts and crises of all kinds. Multilateralism works. It is essential and effective. But multilateral tools and mechanisms are weakening. In the face of rising geopolitical tensions and challenges, some are failing, while others, frameworks that are urgently needed, do not yet exist. The number of conflict-related deaths last year almost doubled. UN peace operations are under unprecedented strain. Nuclear disarmament is at a virtual standstill, and there are no adequate global frameworks to address the security threats posed by new technologies. I urge governments to go further and do better to recommit to their obligations under the UN Charter, to use the full range of diplomatic tools that it provides, to prioritize the prevention of conflict and crises, and to consider the proposals for new frameworks and tools in the new agenda for peace.
Mr. President, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, in clear violation of the United Nations Charter and international law, is aggravating geopolitical tensions and divisions, threatening regional stability, increasing the nuclear threat, and creating deep fissures in our increasingly multipolar world. All this comes at a time when cooperation and compromise for multilateral solutions are needed more than ever to tackle challenges from the climate crisis to unprecedented levels of inequality to disruptive technologies. The United Nations organs have been clear in condemning the war. The General Assembly overwhelmingly approved one resolution demanding that Russia leave Ukraine, and the second rejected Russia's effort to annex Ukrainian territory. I have consistently and repeatedly called for a just and sustainable peace in Ukraine, in line with the Charter and international law, for Ukraine, for Russia, and for the world. Russia's invasion was followed by relentless, systematic attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure and services, including health and education facilities. The war has killed or injured tens of thousands of civilians, destroyed lives and livelihoods, traumatized a generation of children, torn families and communities apart, devastated the economy, and turned vast areas of farmland into deadly minefields. Attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure must stop immediately. Nearly half of Ukraine's population, some 18 million people, need humanitarian assistance and protection. More than 6 million Ukrainians have fled the country. The United Nations has worked collectively to mitigate the impact on people, both in Ukraine and around the world, and to support civilians. Our humanitarian programs have stepped up, distributing aid to more than 8 million people this year, in partnership with over 450 humanitarian organizations, half of them Ukrainian. The International Atomic Energy Agency has established a presence at Zaporizhia nuclear plant and other major Ukrainian nuclear sites to monitor safety, security, and safeguards. Together with the International Committee of the Red Cross, we successfully organized the evacuation of civilians from the Azovstal steel plant in Mariupol last year. Evidence of shocking and widespread human rights violations has been documented by UN agencies, including conflict-related sexual violence, arbitrary detentions, summary executions, mostly by the Russian Federation, and the forcible transfer of Ukrainian civilians, including children, to territory under Russian control or to the Russian Federation. This documentation is vital for accountability. And accountability for all human rights violations is crucial in line with international norms and standards. Mr. President, the war contributed to an unprecedented surge in global food prices, threatening millions with hunger and poverty. Starting in July 2022, we succeeded in mitigating that impact through the Black Sea Initiative and the Memorandum of Understanding between the UN and the Russian Federation. During its one-year period of operation, the Black Sea Initiative, together with Memorandum of Understanding on facilitating exports of Russian food products and fertilizers, helped to reduce global food prices by over 23% from the record high reached in March last year. The Black Sea Initiative enabled the export of 33 million metric tons of grain and foodstuffs and allowed the World Food Programme to transport 725,000 metric tons of wheat for humanitarian aid to countries including Afghanistan and Somalia. Under the Memorandum of Understanding, the United Nations delivered solutions on several of the most challenging areas of trade facilitation for Russian food and fertilizers, with continuous work on the remaining issues. We deeply regret that Russia ended its participation in the Black Sea Initiative in July of this year, and that immediately upon leaving, Russia launched a bombardment of Ukrainian ports and grain storage facilities on the Black Sea and the Danube River. Attacks against terminals and grain stores are unacceptable, and such assaults must end. Civilian shipping in the Black Sea has also been threatened. Further escalation could instantly shock the markets and destabilize the region. Volatility and uncertainty have already returned to international grain markets, while supplies from the harvest in Ukraine pile up. The bombardment is also undermining our efforts in the implementation of the Memorandum of Understanding with the Russian Federation. It has led many of those whose goodwill is needed, notably in the private sector, to question whether there is any real interest in returning to the Black Sea Initiative. We remain engaged with all parties, aiming to ensure safe and secure exports of grain and fertilizer from Russia and Ukraine, and these must be put on a stable footing without the repeated threat of interruption. I'm grateful to the government of Turkey for its contributions and urge all member states to support our efforts. Mr. President, the United Nations continues to work towards a just and lasting peace in Ukraine, in line with the Charter, international law, and the resolutions of the General Assembly. I urge all countries to do their part to prevent further escalation and to lay the foundations for sustainable peace. We are fully committed to the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. This war is already causing limitless suffering. Its continuation risks further perilous escalation. There is never an alternative to dialogue, diplomacy, and a just peace. Thank you.
I thank the Secretary General for this briefing, and I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Volodymyr Zelenskiy, President of Ukraine.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Distinguished Prime Minister Rama, I'm grateful to the Albanian Presidency for the organization of this meeting. Mr. Secretary General, ladies and gentlemen, since the start of the full-scale aggression launched by the state, which for some reason is still present here among the permanent members of the UN Security Council, There's already been 574 days of pain, losses, and struggle. Russia has killed at least tens of thousands of our people and turned millions into refugees by destroying their homes. Most of the world recognizes the truth about this war. It is a criminal and unprovoked aggression by Russia against our nation aimed at seizing Ukraine's territory and resources. But it's not just that. The terrorist state is willing, through its aggression, to undermine all the grounds of international norms meant to protect the world from the wars. And I'm grateful to all those who have recognized Russian aggression as the violation of the UN Charter. Ukraine exercises its right to self-defense, helping Ukraine with weapons in this exercise by imposing sanctions and exerting comprehensive pressure on the aggressor, as well as voting for relevant resolution, would mean helping to defend the UN Charter. The resolutions of the General Assembly have clearly recognized the fact that the only source of this war is Russia, but this has changed nothing for Russia in the United Nations. However, these are the situations that have changed everything for the UN. We should recognize that the UN finds itself in a deadlock on the matters of aggression. Humankind no longer pins its hopes on the UN when it comes to the defense of the sovereign borders of nations. World leaders are seeking new platforms and alliances that could reduce the disastrous scope of problems, the problems that are met here within these walls with rhetoric rather than real solutions, with aspirations to compromise with killers rather than to protect lives. Life should be defended uncompromisingly to ensure successful protection. But I would not be here today if Ukraine had no proposals precisely regarding some specific solutions. Yesterday, in my address to the UN General Assembly, I said that Ukrainian peace formula had become the basis to update the existing security architecture in the world, to restore the real power of the UN Charter and the rule-based international order. Now, I would like to present some very specific details based on the peace formula. Notably, it's point 5, and it's called Implementation of the UN Charter and the Restoration of Ukraine's Territorial Integrity and the World Order. All in the world can see what makes the UN incapable. Unfortunately, this seat in the Security Council, which Russia occupies illegally through backstage manipulations following the collapse of the Soviet Union, have been taken by liars, whose job is to whitewash the aggression and the genocide being carried out by Russia. And all the UN actions, either by the Security Council or by the General Assembly, that could have stopped this aggression are shattered by the privilege granted to the aggressor with this seat. Veto power in the hands of the aggressor is what has pushed the UN into a deadlock. Today, no matter what nation you might be, a nation with hundreds of millions of people, or a small nation, a nation that bravely defends its independence, or a country whose long history of independence can help others, a state in need of help, or a nation that could provide some genuine support, a state relying on its army, or a state considering the UN Charter, but not the army, as its first and last line of defense. Regardless of who you are, the current UN system still makes you less influential than the veto power possessed by a few and misused by one, Russia. That is to the detriment of all other UN members. These days, in the General Assembly, we can hear the word inequality too often. Inequality is mentioned by different nations, both larger and smaller. It is precisely inequality that renders the UN ineffective. I regret that so far the UN Security Council is just the largest and the most visible platform in the world. I believe and I know that UN is capable of more. I'm confident that the UN Charter can actually work for the sake of peace and security globally. However, for this, to happen, the years-long discussions and projects on UN reform must be translated into a viable process of UN reform. And it should not be only about representation here in the Security Council. The use of veto power, that is what requires the reform. And this could be a key reform. That is something that can restore the power of the UN Charter. Ladies and gentlemen, 574 days of the full-fledged Russian aggression means 574 reasons for changes in this chamber. And the numbers of votes in favor of this challenge actually amounts to billions. The absolute majority of people in the world want to live in the world free of aggression. In contrast to all us, there's only a few obsessed individuals in Moscow. Veto right should not serve those who are obsessed with hatred and war. What we observe in the United Nations is an increasing support for the idea that in cases of mass atrocities against human rights, veto power should be voluntarily suspended. But we can also observe that Russia will not give up this stolen privilege voluntarily. Therefore, the UN General Assembly should be given a real power to overcome the veto. This will be the first necessary step. If it is impossible to stop the war because all efforts are vetoed by the aggressor or those who condone the aggressor, it is necessary to bring this issue to the attention of the General Assembly. In the event of two-thirds of the votes reflecting the will of nations from Asia, Africa, Europe, both Americas, and the Pacific region, in other words, a global qualified majority, the veto should be effectively overcome, and such resolution of the General Assembly must be legally binding for all member states. The second step, the UN Security Council must be fully accountable to the nations of the world. I welcome the proposals of various leaders to expand the representation of nations in the Security Council. The composition of the permanent members of the Security Council should reflect the current realities, and justice. Ukraine considers it unjust when billions of people do not have their permanent representation in the Security Council. The African unity must be here permanently. Asia deserves broader permanent representation. It cannot be considered normal when nations like Japan, India, or the Islamic world remains outside the permanent membership of the Security Council. One should take into account the changes that have taken place in Europe, notably that Germany has become one of the key global guarantors of peace and security. This is a fact. Therefore, it is also a matter of fact that Germany deserves a place among the permanent members of the Security Council. Latin America must be represented here permanently, and the Pacific states as well. However, we should not confine our attention to those in top seats only. There is a need to expand the participation and access to the activities of the UN Security Council and its subsidiary bodies for all members of the UN General Assembly who are not recognized as aggressors. At the same time, any participation of the Security Council membership should be suspended for a period of time when such a state resorts to aggression against another nation in violation of the UN Charter. The third step, there is a need for a system to prevent aggression through early response to actions violating territorial integrity and sovereignty of states. It is time to do that. The nations of the world should agree on such a mechanism for responding to aggressions to protect others that everyone would want for their own security. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has shown what can serve such a mechanism. Among other things, powerful sanctions against the aggressor. Not only at a stage when Bucha has already happened, but also at the stage of the build-up of the invasion army. Anyone who wants to start a war should see before their fatal mistake what exactly they will lose when the war would start. The issue of applying such preventive sanctions should be automatically submitted for consideration of the UN Security Council when any member of the UN General Assembly reports a threat of aggression. Ukrainian soldiers now are doing at the expense of their blood what the UN Security Council should do by its voting. They're stopping aggression and upholding the principles of the UN Charter. And now talking about the territorial integrity. This is an element of both the UN Charter and our peace formula that is inextricably linked to the issue of cleaning the territory from the occupiers. occupation is an inexhaustible source of dynamite under the international rule-based order. So I will provide examples of concrete steps to be taken for the security architecture to be strong, using Ukraine as an example. Very specific things, just like Ukrainians. First, complete withdrawal of all Russian troops and military formations, including the Russian Black Sea Fleet or its leaky remnants, as well as the withdrawal of all mercenaries and paramilitary formations of Russia from the entire sovereign territory of Ukraine within our internationally recognized borders as of 1991. Second, full restoration of Ukraine's effective control over the entire state border and exclusive economic zone, including the Black and Azov Seas, as well as in the Kerch Strait. In fact, only the implementation of these 2 points will result in an honest, reliable, and complete cessation of hostilities. Ladies and gentlemen, reform of such international institutions were made following tragedies, following major wars. We should not wait for the aggression to be over. We need to act now. Our aspiration for peace should drive the reform. As I was preparing the Ukrainian peace formula, I underpinned its points by the principles of the UN Charter. Only the principles of the UN Charter and resolutions adopted by the General Assembly. This is precisely what enables the Ukrainian peace formula to become global. The nations that engage with the formula realize that they're working for the rule-based international order, for the protection of territorial integrity and sovereignty of states, protection of human rights, prevention of aggression, and genocidal policy. Naturally, the epicenter of such efforts should be in this very chamber, the UN Security Council chamber, and even to the greater extent in the General Assembly Hall. If reform of UN institutions is necessary for that, then we should not be afraid of such reform. We are ready to work together with UN members who have joined the peace formula to work on relevant draft resolutions and amendments to the UN Charter. And I would like to make it clear for everyone in the world that Ukraine is proposing, while addressing to nations of the world and calling them to join the implementation of the peace formula. Every country can demonstrate its leadership within the framework of one or more, or maybe all points of the peace formula. We can establish groups based on the points of the peace formula, where national security advisors to heads of states and diplomatic representatives work. Now, these groups are tasked to elaborate a list of decisions and legislative proposals to be implemented in order for the relevant point of the peace formula to be fulfilled. We're ready to hold 10 conferences at the level of advisors and in accordance with the 10 points of the peace formula, then a summit on the level of leaders. Later, these drafts would be prepared and submitted for consideration by heads of states at the respective summit. Thereby, all nations of the world that respect peace can actively participate in restoration of peace. Cooperation is always the key word for Ukraine in international relations. This word is also key for peace. So let the peace prevail. May our institutions and our cooperation be stronger. I thank you for your attention, and thank you for the possibility to address you. Thank you for this invitation. Thank you. Glory to Ukraine.
I thank His Excellency President Zelensky for his briefing, and I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the Prime Minister of the Republic of Albania. Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, Head of State and Governments, distinguished representatives, thank you all for being here today. The presence of such considerable number of dignitaries speaks to the very high importance of the issue at hand. Thank you, Secretary General, for your remarks. They resonate with and reflect the values and principles of our organization. President Zelensky, I'm grateful for your presence here at such a tragic moment in your country's history. Your strong words translate the pain of your compatriots and convey very clearly, together with your firm determination, the grit of your people and the unwavering hope of your nation. Excellencies, while today the world needs more than ever an acute sense of responsibility from all of us to confront the multiple challenges and threats facing our planet, conflicts, unconstitutional seizures of power, climate change, devastating floods and unforgiving droughts, including unpredictable and severe wildfires, what we witness instead is more and more disruptive attitudes, reckless acts, and growing conflictuality within and among states. In many parts of the world, the examples of force have proliferated, while the force of example has become a rarity. Who could have imagined, until not long ago, that in the third decade of the 21st century, a disastrous war started by a permanent member of this Council would put Europe at risk by brutally undermining all the principles that gave birth to the United Nations? Who could have imagined, until only a few years ago, that an unjustified, unjust, and unprovoked military aggression of a big country against a new democracy would not be immediately, promptly, and universally condemned by all the nations who gather here and share the same goals and principles? How to understand the yes, buts, or calls on both sides with arguments in order to avoid calling a spade, and which refuse to call a brutal aggression by its only and real name, a man-made tragedy that is inflicting untold suffering to the Ukrainian people, but also reverberating across world regions, hurting growth, raising prices, and threatening with hunger and starvation hundreds of millions of people. An aggression in the heart of Europe cannot be Europe's problem only, as some think, as some say, or as some whisper. Cynics may think that Ukraine is just a problem dropped on the lap of the democratic West to deal with, and they even mumble that what goes around comes around, implying that this is a natural payback for what might have happened before, elsewhere, in other times. Is it? Really? I invite everyone to think twice. This war of aggression must be everyone's business. Let me remind us by paraphrasing the tragic account by Martin Niemöller. First they came for Georgia. I did not speak out. Then they came for Crimea. It was not my country, so I did not speak out. Then they came for the whole Ukraine, but I was not Ukrainian, and I did not speak out. And then they came for me, but there was no one left to help and defend me. As we speak, there have been more than 26,000 civilians that have passed away. Tomorrow the number will be higher, and it will increase every other day for as long as this war continues. Given the inexcusable nuclear saber rattling that keeps coming time and again from different layers of the Kremlin, one is right to fear that one day, God forbid, this madness could turn into something far worse. And don't forget, as unimaginable today as this war was yesterday. Excellencies, we have a duty to help those in need, and in this respect, Ukraine and Ukrainians. We may differ, of course we may differ, on how to support Ukraine in its fight for freedom and dignity. We may have different views on how to end this war. Let's discuss them. But it would be an insult to the intelligence of this organization if we fail to unanimously recognize and say loudly who is the aggressor and who is the aggressed. It is the same sharp difference between war and peace as Tolstoy would remind you. Go back and read him. If we fail to admit this crystal clear truth, we are not only letting down Ukraine and its people, we are failing our core responsibility, compromising the future, and betraying all our children, from Brazil to Spain, from the Arctic to the Southern Pole. The struggle of Ukraine is also the struggle of everyone who aspires to live in a world where nations are free and equal, where territorial integrity is undisputable and their right to live in peace is unquestionable. The contrary is not only short-sighted, but utterly dangerous for everyone under this roof. This is why everyone has to do its part. Albania is a small country. Our continued support to Ukraine may not change the dynamics on the battleground, but it contributes to not rewarding aggression, to not accepting annexation, and not letting the obvious become dubious. And again, I repeat, we may differ on how to deal with this. We may have different views on how to go towards peace. But how possibly we can have different views on who is the aggressor and who is the aggressed? Excellence, le devoir principal.
Excellencies, the main duty of the Security Council is to act decisively on behalf of the entire world and in the service of the world. We can well understand those who are many in number who ask, what is the Security Council doing? The abusive use of the right to veto, sadly, has held the Security Council hostage. It has paralyzed the Council, but it has not reduced it to silence. As we can see, the proof is here in this meeting. The force of rules and values bring us together. They should not be replaced by rules of force and the rejection of values. The world is dangerously tipping into what could become a tragedy for all of us.
Recalling the experience of the Western Balkans, we have seen where the path of brutality can lead to, and the tremendous costs it brings for all, including for the perpetrators. History has confirmed that those who saw war as a shortcut to achieve their goals ended up regretting it forever. Russia has tried many times to use, or better, misuse, the changed reality in the Western Balkans, particularly the birth of the Republic of Kosovo, to justify their neo-imperial dreams and the subsequent nightmare they have exported in Ukraine. No matter how hard one may try, Kosovo, whose independence has been sanctioned by the International Court of Justice, Chapter 14 of this Charter of United Nations, International Court of Justice, cannot serve as a pretext for territory grab or illegal annexations. If today a lasting peace in our region is within reach, this has to do first and foremost with the lesson learned that the most efficient way to overcome the past and shape a common future is through cooperation, not through division, by promoting free movement of people, goods, services, capitals, not by raising artificial barriers, by building bridges for our kids to enjoy freedom and prosperity, whatever their language, whatever their race, whatever their nationality, not erecting walls for our ghosts of the past to seek and hide in endless blame games. I'll end with this. The preamble of the United Nations Charter calls on us to practice tolerance and live together in peace with one another as good neighbors. Important decisions are never a matter of chance. They are always a matter of choice. Albania has made its choice to stand for peace, development and progress, to stand with the aggressed, not with the aggressors, to stand with and to stand for Ukraine. Thank you. I resume now my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Guillermo Lasso Mendoza, Constitutional President of the Republic of Ecuador.
Su Excelencia.
Your Excellency Edi Rama, Prime Minister of the Republic of Albania and President of the Security Council.
Del Consejo de Seguridad.
I would like to thank you for your conduct of the Security Council during this month. It has been almost 19 months since the beginning of the war of aggression against Ukraine. The briefing provided by Secretary General Antonio Guterres continues to appeal to the Russian Federation to give peace an opportunity. This war cannot go on yet another day. The Russian Federation must immediately suspend its military operations in accordance with the order of the International Court of Justice, the ruling of that court, the highest legal system in the world, on the 16th of March 2022. This prolonged war was initially denied and was called a mere special military operation. In addition to destroying Ukraine, costing the lives of thousands of people, it is undermining the very purposes and principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter, in particular that of territorial integrity. At the origin of this organization, when this organization was built, we, the peoples of the United Nations, determined to preserve and spare future generations from the scourge of war, and to that end, to practice tolerance and to coexist in peace as good neighbors. On that basis, the United Nations Charter was built. It is unique. Ecuador has said this before, and we would insist on this point again today. There is not a charter for the South and another charter for the North, nor is there a charter for the West and one charter for the East. In all languages, the content of the charter is the same. It is one and indivisible. There is not one version in Russian and a different version in Spanish. In no case is the use of force to be used against the territorial integrity or the political independence of a state, or to be used in any way which runs counter to the purposes of the United Nations. How can we uphold the principles and purposes of the UN Charter for effective multilateralism and at the same time invade a neighboring country, or not condemn that invasion, maintaining indifference or complicity? On the contrary, to defend the territorial integrity of states means that we must respect and implement the provisions of the UN Charter. We must maintain international peace and security, not to aggress a third state, and to abstain from voting in disputes where we're a party. There are those who say that the crisis of peace and security is due to supposed shortcomings in the Charter, but no reform, no new international framework will be sufficient for peace and security if states are not determined to respect and implement these higher principles. What a fatal blow for multilateralism to have a military invasion of a neighboring country. This war, which has impacted the dynamics and the work done in this Security Council, continues to undermine trust in the UN system. However, beyond the difficulties which this body is facing to have a clear-cut response to this issue, we must underscore the enormous contribution of the United Nations for millions of peoples and humanitarian groups working on the ground, providing emergency assistance, in particular to women and children. I recognize the efforts of the Secretary General in the humanitarian sphere, including in the Black Sea Grain Initiative, and we ask that that initiative be resumed. Mr. President, distinguished colleagues, there are corrosive narratives which claim to justify this war, but there is no justification with any legal foundation. We have been told, for example, that the invasion of Ukraine is in response to a supposed group of countries of the West aiming to weaken Russia. We've been told that Russia is acting in self-defense in the face of anti-Russian policies with regard to some inhabitants or against Russian culture. But what greater act of xenophobia or disregard for one's neighbor than to carry out a war against one's neighbor? There's little truth in that position. We need only look at the pattern of voting in the General Assembly when resolutions have been adopted on the territorial integrity of Ukraine with a vast, clear majority. Of course, there is no veto which can halt the force of the General Assembly when it comes to defending the territorial integrity of its members. And this majority is not a majority of alliances or partnerships, as some claim. Ecuador rejects any invasion, regardless of the country committing that invasion. Moreover, and in particular, if that country holds a permanent seat in this body. The Secretary General, Boutros Boutros-Ghali, affirmed that only a power can impose order on chaos. It is the power of principles which transcend changing perceptions of coexistence in the short term. Ladies and gentlemen, among the hundreds of thousands of people who have fled war, there were some there were many Ecuadorians. Many of them had to flee through emergency operations with a support team out of Ukraine and into neighboring countries. These people were some of the first people impacted by the serious humanitarian fallout of this invasion, which continues to worsen. Millions of people are now forced to leave their homes. They have been the hardest hit. Primarily women, girls, and boys are the ones who are hardest hit. This war has continued to have a global impact as well. It has exacerbated the nuclear threat. It has led to global food insecurity, and it has impacted economies, in particular the economies of developing countries. For all of these reasons, we appeal to the members of the Security Council, individually and collectively, to redouble our support so that the efforts and the good offices of the Secretary General can be played out on the humanitarian and political fronts so that we can work towards just peace based on territorial integrity and on the principles of the UN Charter immediately. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks to His Excellency Mr. Lasso Mendoza for his statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo, President of the Republic of Ghana.
Mr. President, I thank you for making me a part of this important meeting on how we can uphold better the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter, with the unfortunate tragic events in Ukraine serving as a backdrop. I'm grateful to Secretary General Antonio Guterres for making a compelling case of the shared benefits we derive as member states when we choose to be peace-loving, as required by the Charter. Mr. President, none of us here in this chamber can claim not to be aware that our world is in a troubled place. The sharp differences in geopolitical competition among major powers and the intense convergence of the crises in the world, particularly of conflicts, climate change, inequality, unconstitutional changes of government, and unsustainable development, have undermined global trust and solidarity and unraveled the common logic that has prevailed since 1945, which is, it is better to suffer the inadequacies of the multilateral system for the greater good than to pursue the chaos of the unknown for national advantage. In this context, and being mindful of the reality that neither geographic boundaries nor political ideologies have been able to isolate any state from the burden of the prevailing crises, Ghana continues to hope in earnest for an end to the war against Ukraine and for the construction of a future marked by peaceful coexistence, mutual cooperation, and brotherly relations between the two neighboring countries. Indeed, the Russian Federation's aggression against Ukraine is plainly wrong. We have said so on many platforms. The war has had an increasingly devastating toll on the people of Ukraine and the rest of the world, particularly for those of us in Africa, and has challenged our shared values of international peace and security. The turnings of the war have constrained collective efforts in reinvigorating multilateralism and impeded common approaches to confront effectively several complex challenges of our time. For those of us in Ghana, however, the unfolding situation is not a lost cause. Whilst we are rightfully distressed by what is happening around us, we believe that together we can still mitigate the challenges of the unknown if we are prepared to cooperate for a peaceful, careful, managed process of the reform of global institutions that would redistribute fairly responsibilities and authority to reflect the present realities of our world. We also believe that history has a lesson to teach, and the painful lessons of the two previous world wars inspired the solemn commitments made by the founders of the United Nations to refrain from the use of force in their relations among states. That common understanding to replace force and might with the rule of law, cooperation, and the peaceful settlement of disputes underpins the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter and remains valid if we are to avoid a Hobbesian state of affairs in interstate relations. We must thus work together strongly to reverse the growing fragmentation of our world and the elevation of nationalist ideologies and actions above commonly accepted rules. Violation of sovereignty and territorial integrity of states and attempts to normalize such violations or selectively apply the rules of international law and the Charter would only undermine the promise of the past and the hope for future generations. It is in this regard that Ghana continues to be a firm advocate for dialogue and diplomacy in resolving the Russian war against Ukraine. We do not do so because of want of a resolution of the dispute at any cost, but united in our belief with many others, we believe the only pathway for a comprehensive, peaceful, and sustainable resolution of the dispute is one that must be just and based on the Charter of the United Nations and international law. In taking a principled position on the conflict in Ukraine, Ghana has been concerned about the ramifications of the war on the global community and multilateralism. We therefore welcome the opportunity that the new agenda for peace provides, which is to reset our common understanding on how, among others, we relate with each other as states, can reinforce the preemptory norms of international law that have provided us stability for almost 8 decades, and find new ways of addressing old challenges that continue to undermine states and the sovereignty of nations. Mr. President, in support of the choices we need to make for a renewed and inclusive multilateralism, I would want to share 3 key messages. Firstly, many of the organs and institutions established by the Charter, such as for the Security Council, continue to be relevant, but the Council's composition and working methods need renewal through the completion of the long outstanding reforms. In support of the Common African Position on Security Council reforms contained in the Azulwini Consensus, Ghana urges a transformation of the dialogue among member states to envisage an endpoint that delivers a Security Council that is representative and which also addresses the historical injustice done the continent of Africa. To overcome knotty discussions around the veto, we encourage the ongoing efforts to limit its use and the subsequent placement of a moratorium on its use that will lead progressively to its removal over a reasonable period of time. We cannot continue to have a Security Council that is structurally limited from being effective and yet demands universal acceptance for its decisions. As with many other things in life, with changes, we need to adapt, and with authority comes a responsibility that must be kept. Secondly, the peace of the world is indivisible and integrated with all other global arrangements beyond our collective security. Our efforts at preventive diplomacy must be comprehensive and broad-based. We need to be aware that, for instance, inimical economic and financial policies have an enduring impact on peace, and that global policies in the structure and functioning of international institutions cannot remove the centrality of peace from their raison d'etre. We must strengthen in a comprehensive and integrated manner our efforts in preventing the outbreak of violence or resurgence of new conflicts. Thirdly and finally, multilateralism at the global level must be accompanied by effective regional partnerships, partnerships that help to anticipate better threats to our common humanity, which prioritize specific means for resolving differences, and which cuts across regions to enhance its effectiveness when required. When we fail to leverage fully the potential of regional bodies, we can only have ourselves to blame when multilateral efforts at the global level are unable to deliver. In ending, I call again for peace in Ukraine and emphasize, as my delegation has often done in this Council, that there is no alternative to winning the peace in Ukraine. We hope the Council can help this United Nations to assume an enhanced role in support of peace efforts around the world, but in particular in Ukraine, for the benefit of all peoples. Mr. President, I thank you for your indulgence.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Akufo-Addo for his statement. And now I give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Alain Berset, President of the Swiss Federation.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Thank you, first and foremost, for organizing this debate, and I also wish to take this opportunity to thank the Secretary General of the United Nations for his remarks. But beyond his remarks, I wish to thank him for his steadfast, unstinting commitment to the advancement of peace, the advancement of dialogue, and especially when it is most difficult. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, the facts, and they are not positive. The times we live in are marked by the questioning of multilateralism, the multiplication of conflicts, and the deepening of inequalities. And there's a question, where's our responsibility? Where does our responsibility, our shared responsibility lie? Our responsibility, we who have convened here, at the very minimum, that is to recall the essential principles enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations. I've had a copy here, of course, and to fulfill the mandate which has been entrusted to us. This core text expresses our desire, our shared desire, the shared desire of all peoples to live in peace. And this text is a guarantor of universal values, the overarching principles of a multilateral order, sovereign equality of states, and a prohibition on the use of force, defense of human rights, including economic, social progress for people. And in this war, as we know, war, the suffering of civilians is a common denominator. It is always civilian suffering. And international humanitarian law imposes obligations upon us and upon all parties to conflict. As you are aware, Swiss is a depository of the Geneva Conventions. We are faithful to the long-standing tradition in this regard, and we are very much staunchly determined to uphold it and to ensure respect for international humanitarian law. And as members of the Council, we have committed to commit and implement this clear, unique mandate conferred upon us by the Charter of the United Nations, conferred upon all of us here, namely the maintenance of international peace and security. With Russia's military aggression against Ukraine, the Charter has been violated at a large scale. On a massive scale, yet session after session, Russia, a permanent member of this Council, has been denying its responsibility for the thousands of dead and wounded in Ukraine, its responsibility for the millions of displaced persons, and finally its responsibility for all those plunged into deep insecurity wherever they are in the world, including, incidentally, in Russia. The consequences of this war, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, the consequences of this war are planetary in nature. Global food security has been undermined. The energy sector has been disrupted. Nuclear risks are increasing. Inequalities are growing. Switzerland demands that the Russian Federation respect the Charter, that it respect its principles. And once again, we call upon the Russian Federation to cease hostilities, to withdraw its troops from Ukrainian territory, and respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. Ladies and gentlemen, while the mandate of the Security Council is clear, it is not always as effective as it should be, as one would desire. While the objective is to save lives, guarantee global security, reinforce stability, our discussions are bogged down on issues that fail to produce tangible results on certain issues. This Council must not squander the most precious asset at its disposal, the trust of those who rely on it, to work to guarantee them a life in dignity and peace. And we have the means to fulfill this mandate, as has been illustrated in the 26 resolutions that the Security Council has adopted since the month of January. These are resolutions that are geared towards promoting peace and security in Colombia, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and in South Sudan. And these examples are really there to show us that the Security Council, even though it is more difficult than in the past, has retained its capacity for action. Of course, there's an urgent need for reform, and Switzerland has been committed for a number of years to greater and better representation, beginning with the African countries, committed also to better working methods. And yet we are all aware of the fact that no reform can replace the will of states to respect the Charter. In the new agenda for peace, the Secretary General has indicated further steps forward to step up our action in multilateralism, to strengthen to close ranks around the principles of universality, of solidarity, and trust. And we have been assuming this duty of solidarity. In Ukraine, we are committed to alleviating the suffering of the civilian population, rendering justice to the victims, promoting a political solution to the conflict in due time. We have opened our doors to people fleeing the war. We have been delivering humanitarian aid. We have been collaborating with the Ukrainian government on the process of reconstruction. And the challenges, the tasks facing Ukraine are immense. To give just one example, an area four times the size of Switzerland. Switzerland is not a large country. 4 times the size of Switzerland. That is the territory of Ukraine, which has been contaminated with mines. And there, too, we have been supporting humanitarian demining with our know-how and with deliveries of equipment and a commitment that we will continue to shore up. And it is in the same spirit of solidarity that we are calling for the relaunching of the Black Sea Initiative. We wish to take this opportunity to express our gratitude to the Secretary General for his tireless efforts in this regard. Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, multilateralism is the only option to achieve peace, the only way to move away from individualistic thinking in which each side seeks only to defend their own interests, to maximize their own influence, the only option to relaunch the search for common sustainable solutions that guarantee a dignified life for all. And against this backdrop, in this spirit, Switzerland welcomes diplomatic initiatives in favor of a lasting peace in Ukraine, a peace rooted in the principles of the Charter of the United Nations, the Charter which is truly the cornerstone of peaceful coexistence of all states. In the past and today, threats, isolationism, violence have never provided answers to the dysfunctions and imbalances of the world in which we live. And this Council, Security Council, can only successfully fulfill its mandate. Therefore, ensure the common desire of all people of this world to live in peace and security to be made a reality. Only can it achieve this if it acts in a spirit of trust and collaboration. This spirit must guide everyone around this table. Today, we have an opportunity to reverse course, to change the situation. We have this opportunity, but there's a need for will to be there, for ardent will to be there, because a lasting peace is worth more than any fleeting gain. Thank you.
Mr. Berset for his statement. And now I give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Fumio Kishida, Prime Minister of Japan.
Mr. President, at the outset, I would like to commend the leadership of the Albanian Prime Minister Rama, for convening this high-level Security Council meeting on multilateralism and the situation in Ukraine. I also welcome the participation of President Zelensky of Ukraine. Today, the international order based on the rule of law is facing an unprecedented crisis and challenge. It is the Charter of the United Nations that is the foundation of international order. The Charter provides that the Security Council has primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. We are gathered here today because of the infringement of the rule of law by one of the permanent members of this very council. Mr. President, I visited Kyiv and Bucha in March of this year, and also went to the sites of the tragedies. I will never forget the heartbreaking feelings I had at that time. I renew my determination that Japan stands with Ukraine. We condemn in the strongest terms Russia's aggression against Ukraine, which is a clear violation of international law, including the UN Charter. The aggression must be stopped immediately, and the troops must be withdrawn right now and unconditionally. Any attempt to unilaterally change the peacefully established status of territories by force or coercion must not be tolerated anywhere in the world. Irresponsible nuclear rhetoric, the deployment of nuclear weapons in Belarus, and the occupation and militarization of Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant pose a threat to world peace and stability. Russia's nuclear threats, let alone its use of nuclear weapons, are unacceptable. Abuse of the veto power to obstruct the decisions of the Security Council and undermine its credibility cannot be accepted by the international community. Mr. President, Russia's aggression against Ukraine has exacerbated concerns over a rule of lawlessness around the world. We must not allow the creation of a second or third Ukraine. It is essential to achieve a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine conforming to the principles of the UN Charter in order to protect an international order based on the rule of law. Japan supports President Zelenskyy's sincere efforts to uphold the basic principles of the United Nations Charter in his peace formula. In Hiroshima in May, I myself, together with leaders of a wide range of countries, including Ukraine, affirmed the importance of the principles of the Charter, including respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity, and the peaceful resolution of disputes. Following these discussions, 2 meetings of national security advisors on Ukraine were held. Japan welcomes the participation of many countries, including the so-called Global South, and will continue to make a positive contribution. Mr. President, we must not forget that the aggression against Ukraine has caused serious problems such as refugees, food and energy insecurity, and threats to nuclear safety, and has led to suffering for many people around the world. Japan is committed to working together with other nations to promote efforts to support the afflicted people. Japan strives to promote human-centered international cooperation, overcoming differences in regimes and values in order to protect human dignity. Mr. President, there has never been a time when effective multilateralism, the theme of today's debate, is more needed than now. We must overcome numerous calamities, including the aggression against Ukraine, and realize multilateralism rooted in a spirit of solidarity. Bearing this in mind, I myself have engaged in a series of discussions with leaders of various countries. Japan has also organized Security Council open debate on the rule of law and peace building during our Council presidency to listen to the diverse voices of the international community. Japan will further strengthen its efforts to resolve issues concerning international peace and security, including through preventive diplomacy, while upholding the rule of law under multilateralism. Mr. President, Now is the time to return to the unshakable principles that we, the member states, have built up since 1945, including the United Nations Charter, and work toward a world of cooperation, not division and confrontation. To this end, strengthening the functions of the UN is an urgent task. The Security Council must be enlarged in both its permanent and non-permanent seats to better reflect the realities of today's world, including Africa. We must now take concrete action looking ahead to the Summit of the Future and the 80th anniversary of the establishment of the United Nations. It is time to move forward to realize the UN as a platform that listens to people facing difficulties and works with them to confront challenges together, aiming for a world that respects human dignity. Thank you for your attention.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Kishida for his statement, and I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Robert Abella, Prime Minister of the Republic of Malta.
Thank you, Eddie, Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, dear colleagues, excellencies, and also dear friends. First of all, I would like to kick off by thanking the Albanian Presidency for having organized this high-level open debate of the Security Council. I also thank the Secretary General for sharing his thoughts with us earlier today. 12 years ago, soon after the outbreak of the Arab Spring, Malta had launched its bid to serve on the Security Council. That was a time, I remember, of turmoil, also instability in our immediate neighborhood, but also it was a time of hope and aspirations. The decision to embark on this journey stemmed from our commitment to the principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter. They are timeless and also universal and an integral part of our foreign policy. Our unwavering belief is that multilateralism, today's major theme that we are discussing, holds the answer to contemporary challenges, and that all countries should engage proactively to this end, and this served as our point of departure way back. Today, as elected members of this Council, these convictions continue to serve as our guiding light. Mr. President, more than ever, the world today needs an effective multilateral system with the United Nations at its core. We must redouble our efforts to uphold and also defend the fundamental principles that unite us. We must promote our common values at a time when they are being aggressively undermined and threatened. We must protect them and adequately respond to any contempt for these values. At the same time, we must not lose sight of the fact that we are living in a world where conflicts, unfortunately, are on the rise. The nuclear threat still looms. The climate crisis is, unfortunately, spiraling out of control. Democracy and human rights are under a systematic attack. Global inequalities are deepening. Disinformation and misinformation campaigns are feeding as well as amplifying tensions. No country by itself can tackle these complex and existential challenges. They require our full and collective attention. Effective multilateralism is the only avenue to address these challenges in a decisive and holistic manner. Mr. President, if we are to reach these ambitious goals, we cannot resign ourselves to living in a world where might is right. Last year, the Russian Federation began its aggression against the Ukraine, violating its sovereignty and also its territorial integrity. These acts constitute a blatant violation of the United Nations Charter and also a violation of international law. They were overwhelmingly deplored and rejected by the General Assembly, who had called for Russia's immediate withdrawal of its military forces and the cessation of hostilities. This war profoundly undermines the multilateral system. It weakens and also destabilizes this very Council, the immediate and long-term consequences of such actions by a permanent member of this Council cannot be emphasized enough. And on the occasion of this debate, I reiterate Malta's full support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. I equally underline Ukraine's inherent right to self-defense as enshrined in Article 51 of the United Nations Charter. Ukrainian people have paid the heaviest price as a result of this unjustified and unprovoked war of aggression. It has led to another human-made catastrophe as the world was still struggling to find the path to normality following a crippling COVID pandemic. All wars are indeed devastating, and this is, of course, no exception. Lost lives are gone forever and will never be recovered. The scars of those wounded, injured, and traumatized by conflict never fully heal. Once the fighting is over, the road to recovery will still be a long and arduous one. Through its actions, Russia did not only bring war back to Europe's shores, it also generated a global food crisis that has seriously impacted mostly developing countries around the world. And while the Black Sea Grain Initiative allowed almost 33 million tons of grain to be shipped, Russia's unilateral decision to pull out of the deal has seen grain prices unfortunately soar up. Again, I once again state Malta's here uncompromising position that using hunger and food supplies as weapons of war is completely unacceptable. In closing, Mr. President, I reiterate and emphasize once again that there can be no peace in our future if the strong can trample on the weak. There can be no peace if international law can be brushed aside, if geopolitical interests so demand. There can be no peace if the rights of states and individuals can be suspended or revoked at any time. Malta's commitment to peace, dialogue, and multilateralism remain as strong as ever. We remain firm in our resolve to stay at the forefront of the defense of the United Nations Charter, no matter how difficult or disheartening circumstances may seem. We must never give up on peace. We must never give up on dialogue, and we simply cannot afford to do so. In this time of upheaval, our collective reply is to redouble and redouble and redouble our efforts and continue to invest in our multilateral system. In doing so, we must also reform this Council to make sure it is truly fit for purpose in today's world. A Council that is more transparent, more effective, more representative, more accountable, and also more democratic. Meanwhile, we remain convinced that the only step towards a lasting peace in Ukraine is for Russia to immediately cease all hostilities. It must unconditionally withdraw all its forces and also its military equipment from the entire territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Abella for his statement. Et je donne maintenant la parole à
I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Raymond Dongsima, Prime Minister of Gabon.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. President, I thank the UN Secretary-General for his enlightening briefing on the terrible conditions and the fallout of the war in Ukraine 19 months after the outbreak of war. Since the beginning of hostilities in Ukraine, my country has expressed its opposition to the war and condemned the violation of Ukraine's territorial integrity. We have unequivocally reaffirmed the principles of the UN Charter as the underpinning of our coexistence. Above all, Gabon has tirelessly called for an immediate ceasefire and for negotiations in good faith between the parties to be taken up in order to silence the weapons. 570 days since the beginning of this deadly war, the shock wave has continued to spread beyond the borders of Ukraine. Millions of people have been forced to flee within Ukraine, and millions more are now refugees beyond national borders. Deaths are counted in the thousands, while indiscriminate shelling continues to target essential structures, not sparing nuclear power plants, bridges, hydroelectric dams, schools, or hospitals in the path, and the nuclear threat has become even more widespread. The international system, in particular the agricultural sector, as well as many value chains, continue to suffer from the fallout of this conflict. This has worsened the global humanitarian toll by sowing hunger, precariousness, despair, and fear, but also invisible wounds such as hatred and the rejection of others. As we assess this situation, it is not clear whether or not the trauma suffered by children, women, and men exposed to the horrors of war will be reflected in the final tally of this conflict. On this point, we wonder how much horror must be suffered before de-escalation is finally considered. How much terror must be sown before the warring parties agree to sit down to talk. Mr. President, since the outset of hostilities, every rostrum in the United Nations has been the stage for accusations and for opposition. They have not provided relief or remedy for those who have fallen in the trenches or who have been crushed under the debris in the battlefields and in the cities and villages of Ukraine. An alternative to war is possible, and it must be found in existing channels outlined in the UN Charter and in relevant resolutions of this Council. Without delay, we must reconcile with the spirit of the UN Charter. Its beating heart is our common determination to spare present and future generations from the scourge of war. My country reiterates its appeal to the parties to negotiate in good faith in order to put an end to this war. We call on the parties to show restraint and responsibility. Everything must be done to ensure de-escalation and to create conditions which will allow for diplomacy. Gabon is convinced that any unilateral action which further deadlocks the situation, hardens positions, and fuels antagonisms must be ruled out. I reiterate my country's opposition to war, opposition to the war in Ukraine, but opposition to any war in the world, in particular the many chronic and cyclical wars in Africa. Rejecting the mindset of war is not fleeing war, nor is it a sign of cowardice or an opportunist stance. We must draw from the indelible lessons of the history of unjust wars, which have been hammered home, that the fact that those who cause, provoke, or maintain these wars are rarely the winners. Beyond the criminal responsibility which can be established, the tribunal of history will be uncompromising, and that is why we reject this mindset of war. We must uphold the noble ideals of the United Nations. My country has a long-standing tradition of peace which has never let us down. We had to take existential choices about our future. We've always been able to opt for peace, and we continue to defend this ideal, which we believe is an imperative, because the war runs counter to the values which underpin this organization and the Security Council. Every day of war brings into question our calling, our mandate, and our credibility. In conclusion, I would like to work together with the parties to help restore peace in Ukraine, because we stand for peace in Ukraine. We support the process of peace and dialogue, and every initiative which aims to activate the channels of diplomacy and to silence the weapons in Ukraine is a good thing. We support the initiatives for peaceful coexistence between Russia and Ukraine. Thank you.
Je remercie son
I thank His Excellency Mr. Ndong Sima for his statement.
To His Excellency the Right Honourable Oliver Dowden, a Member of Parliament, Deputy Prime Minister of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland.
Thank you, President. I am proud to sit here today in solidarity
with President Zelensky. He and the Ukrainian people have met Russia's invasion of their country with bravery and with courage. I pay tribute to their fortitude. Ukraine's fight against Russian aggression is not only a fight for freedom, it is also a fight for the principles upon which the United Nations itself is based. Principles underpinned by our Charter, which says that all state sovereignty is equal, that territorial integrity is inviolable, that disputes should be settled peacefully, and that we must protect those things together. When Russia's tanks rolled into Ukraine, they trampled over every single one of those principles. They have done so ever since. Every missile, every bomb, every false arrest, every piece of propaganda has been a flagrant assault not only on freedom, but on our multilateral rules-based system. If we allow Russia to lay waste to what we have built here, the risks to world order, the risks to us all, are grave. For over a year and a half, Ukraine has been suffering the terrible consequences of Russia's war of choice. We must never forget the human cost. 9,500 people killed, 17,000 people injured, reports of 500,000 military casualties on both sides. Russia has callously targeted schools, hospitals, even playgrounds. Ukrainians have been tortured and they have been raped. Men, women, and thousands of children have been forcibly deported from their homes. And the devastation flows beyond Ukraine's borders. Thanks to their destruction of thousands of tons of grain, the hungry and malnourished people of the developing world are Russia's victims too. That is why the United Kingdom will contribute a further £3 million to the World Food Programme to continue President Zelenskyy's Grain from Ukraine initiative. Of course, the only way to end this widespread suffering is through a just and lasting peace. Ukraine has demonstrated their commitment to peace time and time again, including in Copenhagen and in Jeddah this summer. But they have also shown on the battlefield this summer that they are capable of restoring the sovereignty and territorial integrity that must be the foundations of any peace. Ukraine's counteroffensive has put Russia under pressure. In total, Ukraine has regained 50% of the territory seized since the war began. And in Kharkiv and Kherson, the yellow and blue flag flies high once again. That flag flies throughout the rest of the world, reflecting the solidarity we feel to Ukraine. Yet, we may wonder, what difference does this support make when Russia seems so impervious to United Nations demands? When it seeks to fuel its aims with arms from sanctioned states such as Iran and the DPRK, and when it conducts sham elections in Ukraine's own sovereign territory? The truth is this: Russia knows the power of collective action because it tries so hard to weaken and divide the international community. So, just as we need to confront our biggest challenges on global poverty, on climate change, on artificial intelligence collectively, we need effective multilateralism to achieve resolution, to seek justice for the many, many victims, to rebuild ruined cities and create new opportunities, to get grain exports flowing again, to help put Ukraine back on the path to prosperity, to secure peace. And that is what we shall do together. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank His Excellency the Right Honourable Dowden for his statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Antony Blinken, Secretary of State of the United States of America.
Thank you very much. Mr. Prime Minister, thank you for focusing the Security Council on this critically important issue. And Mr. Secretary General, thank you for the moral clarity that you've shown in dealing with Russia's war against Ukraine. We're grateful to have been able to welcome President Zelensky to this council table, and we thank him. We thank him for reminding us yesterday, today, and every day what's at stake in this conflict, not just for Ukraine, not just for Ukrainians, but for all of us. Fellow council members, 2 weeks ago, I was in Yehidny, a small Ukrainian town about 2 hours north of Kyiv. Russian forces seized the village in the first days of the invasion. They went door to door, rounding up residents at gunpoint, marching them to the local elementary school, where Russian soldiers had set up a command post. Then, soldiers forced more than 300 civilians, mostly women, children, and elderly people, into a basement not fit for human habitation. Just a few small rooms, no windows, no circulation, no running water. The soldiers held residents there for 28 straight days, using them as human shields, before fleeing when Ukrainian defenders arrived to liberate the town. In Yehidny, 2 residents took me into the basement where they and others had been imprisoned. My guides said that they were packed together so tightly that they could barely breathe. There was no room to sit, let alone lie down. When they cried out to their captors that people were sick and needed medical care, a Russian soldier yelled back, "Let them die." My guide pointed to 2 handwritten lists of names on the basement wall. One was for the villagers that Russian forces had executed. The other for the people who died in the basement. The oldest victim was 93 years old. The youngest, 6 weeks old. The Russians only allowed the removal of bodies once a day. So children, parents, husbands, and wives were forced to spend hours next to the corpses of their loved ones. I begin here because from the comfortable distance of this chamber, it's really easy to lose sight of what it's like for Ukrainian victims of Russian aggression. This is what happened in just one building, in one community in Ukraine. There are so many others like it. In the last week alone, Russia has bombed apartment buildings in Kryvyi Rih. It's burned down humanitarian aid depots in Lviv. It's demolished grain silos in Odessa. It shelled 8 communities in Sumy in a single day. This is what Ukrainian families are living through every day. It's what they've experienced for 574 days of this full-scale invasion. It's what they'll endure tomorrow and the day after that for as long as Russia wages its vicious war. A war that President Putin openly declared from the outset is aimed at erasing Ukraine from the map as a sovereign country and restoring Russia's lost empire. In this war, there is an aggressor and there is a victim. One side is attacking the core principles of the UN Charter. The other fights to defend them. For over a year and a half, Russia has shredded the major tenets of the United Nations Charter, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, international humanitarian law, and flouted one Security Council resolution after another. Let's review. First, Russia's invasion itself violates the central pillar of the UN Charter, respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all nations. Second, Russia is committing war crimes and crimes against humanity in Ukraine on an almost daily basis. Third, Russia continues to engage in reckless nuclear saber-rattling, announcing that it's stationing nuclear weapons in Belarus and continuing to use Europe's biggest nuclear power plant and its employees as a shield for its aggression, risking catastrophic consequences. Fourth, Russia is weaponizing hunger. Thanks to the Black Sea Grain Initiative, brokered by the Secretary General and Turkey, approximately 33 million metric tons of grain reached global markets, driving down food prices around the world. Nearly 2/3 of the wheat exported through that deal went to developing countries. Not only did Putin pull out of the deal, but Russia is now mining Ukraine's fields, bombing its ports and rails, burning its silos. As a result, Ukraine's wheat exports will likely fall by 2.8 million metric tons this year. That is the equivalent of 5.5 billion loaves of bread trapped in the world's breadbasket. Russia, meanwhile, on track for a record year of grain exports. The hungrier the world is, the more Moscow profits. Fifth, Russia is using Iranian drones to attack Ukrainian civilians. Drones that Russia procured from Iran in violation of Security Council Resolution 2231. Finally, just last week, Russia hosted North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un. Putin said that they discussed ways to cooperate militarily, while Kim pledged the DPRK's, and I quote, full and unconditional support, end quote, for Russia's war of aggression. Of course, the transfer of arms between Moscow and Pyongyang would violate multiple resolutions of this council. It's hard to imagine a country demonstrating more contempt for the United Nations and all that it stands for. This from a country with a permanent seat on this council. President Putin is betting that if he keeps doubling down on the violence, that if he's willing to inflict enough suffering on enough people, the world will cave on its principles and Ukraine will stop defending itself. But Ukrainians are not giving up, for they've seen what life would look like if they submit to Russian control. It's that basement in Yehidny. It's families having their children torn away from them and deported to Russia. Children taken away from their parents and deported far away. It's the rubble of Mariupol. It's the mass graves of Bucha. We are not giving up either. Indeed, since we were last here, a growing number of countries have come together to try to forge a different way forward. In June, over a dozen countries met with Ukraine in Copenhagen to discuss the path toward a just and lasting peace, one that upholds the United Nations Charter and its core principles. 2 months later, more than 40 countries, including many members of this council, carried forward that discussion with Ukraine and Jeddah. President Zelensky has put forward a 10-point plan for such a peace. President Putin has put forward nothing. Now, some argue that continuing to stand with Ukraine and holding Russia accountable distracts us from addressing other priorities, like confronting the climate crisis, expanding economic opportunity, strengthening health systems. That is a false choice. We can and we must do both. We are doing both. We must work together to tackle the global challenges that are affecting our people, meet the Sustainable Development Goals, invest in a world where all people have an opportunity to reach their full potential. The United States is the world's leading contributor to these efforts. And as President Biden told the General Assembly yesterday, we will continue to do more than our share to answer the imperatives of our time. At the same time, as President Biden has made clear, we must continue to shore up the pillars of peaceful relations among nations, without which we will be unable to achieve any of our goals. That's why we must send a clear message, not only to Russia, but to all would-be aggressors, that we will stand up, not stand by, when the rules that we all agreed to are being challenged. Not only to prevent conflict, instability, and suffering, but to lay the foundation for all that we can do to improve people's lives in times of peace. I opened by sharing the horrors that I saw in Yehidny. Let me close by telling you what else I saw that day in Ukraine. I saw volunteers rebuilding homes that had been razed by Russian bombs, farmers harvesting fields, people reopening businesses, citizens clearing mines and unexploded ordnance, children returning to schools. In short, I saw a nation rebuilding and reclaiming its future. That is the right of all members of our United Nations. That's what we defend when we stand up for the international order. The right of people not only to survive, but to thrive, to write their own future. Our people, Ukraine's people, the people of all nations, get to write their own future. We cannot, we will not let one man write that future for us. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Blinken for his statement, and now I give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Sergei Lavrov, Minister for Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, colleagues, the existing international order was based on the ruins and following the colossal tragedy of the Second World War. Its basis was the Charter of the United Nations, became the Charter of the United Nations, the key source of modern international law, largely thanks to thanks to the United Nations, a new world war was averted, a new world war which was fraught with nuclear disaster. Unfortunately, after the end of the Cold War, the collective West, led by the U.S., single-handedly decided that it would determine fates of all of humankind, and with its complex of superiority began to more frequently and broadly ignore the legacy of the founding fathers of the United Nations. Today, the West turns selectively to norms and principles on a case-by-case basis, exclusively based on their parochial geopolitical needs. This has resulted in a shaking of global stability, as well as the exacerbation and the fomenting of new hotbeds of tension. Risks of global conflict have heightened. In order to curb them, in order to bring things on a peaceful path, the Russian Federation has and continues to insist on all provisions of the United Nations Charter being respected and applied not selectively, but fully in their full and interconnected way. This includes the principle of the sovereign equality of states, non-intervention in their domestic affairs, respect for territorial sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the right of peoples to self-determination. And the actions of the U.S. and their allies attest to the systematic violation of the balance of needs which have been enshrined in the Charter. Since the collapse of the USSR and the establishment of independent states in its place, the U.S. and its satellites have egregiously and openly interfered in the domestic affairs of Ukraine, as was publicly and even with pride recognized by the Deputy Secretary of State Victoria Nuland in 2013. The $5 billion was spent on cultivating Ukrainian politicians in Kyiv by the West. All of the facts are being swept under the rug. Their attempts to cancel all of what happened since prior to 2014. And for this reason, the theme of today's meeting proposed by the Albanian presidency is most apt, which allows us to restore the chronological succession of events, specifically in the context of relations of the main acting parties in the implementation of the principles and the purposes of the UN Charter. In 2004 to 2005, the West, with the aim of bringing to power pro-American candidate, sanctioned the first coup in Kyiv, forcing the Constitutional Court of Ukraine to adopt an unlawful decision on the conduct of something which was stated in the Constitution, namely a third round of elections. And even more unceremonial intervention in domestic affairs was cleared during the second Maidan in 2013 to 24. Then a litany of Western leaders directly encouraged participants in anti-government demonstrations and acts of violence. The same Victoria Nuland discussed with the U.S. ambassador in Kyiv the composition of the future government to be composed of putschists and the EU's real place in world policy. We all remember her obscene 2 words, showing that the EU swallowed this. In February 2014, the U.S. selected individuals who became key participants in the brutal coup, which was organized, I would recall, one day after what was reached under the guarantees of Germany, Poland, and France. I refer to the agreement between the legitimately elected president of Ukraine and the opposition leaders. The principle of non-intervention in domestic affairs was repeatedly trampled upon. Immediately after the coup, the putschists announced that their top priority was to deny the rights of Russian language speakers in Ukraine, and the residents of Crimea and southeast of the country who refused to reconcile themselves to the outcomes of the coup were labeled terrorists. A punitive operation was unleashed against them. In response to this, Crimea and Donbass conducted referenda fully in line with the principles of equality and self-determination of peoples, which are enshrined in paragraph 2 of Article 1 of the UN Charter. Western diplomats and politicians vis-à-vis Ukraine have been turning a blind eye to this important norm of international law. They have been trying to take all the background and the essence of what has happened and trying to distill this to the inadmissibility of violation of territorial integrity. Let us recall in this connection, a UN declaration was adopted unanimously in 1970. This was a declaration on the principle of international law pertaining to friendly relations and cooperation amongst states. In line with the Charter of the United Nations, enshrines the following: the principle for the respect of territorial integrity is applicable, I quote, to states who, in their actions, comply with the principle of equality and self-determination of peoples, and subsequently having governments which represent the entire people residing on the given territory. End of quote. To the fact that the Ukrainian neo-Nazis who seized power in Kiev did not represent the population of Crimea and Donbass is something which does not need to be proven, and the unconditional support from Western capitals of the criminal actions of the Kiev regime is nothing other than a violation of the principle of self-determination subsequent to an egregious violation in interference in domestic affairs. Poroshenko and Zelensky adopted racist laws on the prohibition of everything Russian: education, media, culture, the destruction of books and monuments, a prohibition on the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, seizure of its property. These all became blatant violations of paragraph 3, Article 1 of the UN Charter on the respect for human rights and basic freedoms for all, without distinction as to race, gender, language, and religion. Not to mention the fact that these actions directly ran counter to the constitution of Ukraine itself, the constitution which sets out the obligation of the state to respect the rights of Russian and other national minorities. When we hear calls for implementation of the peace formula to bring Ukraine back to the 1991 borders, a question arises, who is being called for this? Those calling for this, are they familiar with the statements of Ukrainian leadership about what they intend to do with the residents of the relevant territories? And with respect to them, publicly, at the official level, repeatedly there have been threats voiced of their physical or legal annihilation. Incidentally, similarly, Western not only has not been deterring its Western protégés in Kiev, but has enthusiastically been encouraging this anti-Russian policy. Incidentally, similarly, members of the EU and NATO have for decades been encouraging the actions of Latvia and Estonia to strip the rights of hundreds of thousands of Russian language residents who have been called non-citizens. Now there is a serious discussion for the introduction of criminal responsibility, criminal liability for the use of their mother tongue. Senior officials officially state that the spread of information about the possibility of remote school programs, that this possibility needs to be considered as something almost a threat to national security, which requires the attention of law enforcement bodies. Turning back to Ukraine, in February 2015, the Minsk agreements were reached, and this included they were approved by a Special Security Council resolution fully in line with Article 36 of the Charter, which supports, I quote, any procedure for the resolution of disputes that was adopted by the parties. In this specific case, Kiev, Donetsk, and Lugansk. However, last year, all of the signatories of the Minsk agreements, except for Mr. Putin, I refer to Merkel, Hollande, and Poroshenko, publicly, and with some kind of pleasure even, recognized that having signed this document, they had no intention of implementing it. They were simply looking to gain time to shore up the military capability of Ukraine and to funnel weapons into the country to be used against Russia. For all of these years, if EU and NATO directly supported the sabotage of the Minsk agreements, encouraged the Kyiv regime to use force to address problems in Donbass, and this was all in breach of Article 25 of the Charter, according to which all members of the United Nations agreed to accept and carry out the decisions of the Security Council. Let us recall that the package with the Minsk agreements, the heads of Russia, Germany, France, and Ukraine signed a declaration where Berlin and Paris assumed an obligation to do a lot, including to help to restore the banking system in Donbass. But they didn't move a finger. They merely observed how, contrary to all of those obligations, Poroshenko announced a trade, economic, and transport blockade against Donbass. In that same declaration, Berlin and Paris assumed an obligation to comply with a trilateral agreement in the EU, Russia, Ukraine format to practically resolve issues of concern to Russia in the area of trade, as well as to advance the establishment of a shared humanitarian economic space from Atlantic to the Pacific, I quote. This declaration was also endorsed by the Security Council and was also subject to implementation in line with Article 25. But this obligation also of the leaders of Germany and France was an empty promise and yet another violation of Charter principles. Recently, the foreign minister of the Gromyko, the Soviet Union prime minister, said better to have 10 years of negotiations rather than a day of war. Following this, we have been engaged in painstaking negotiations, reaching agreements on European security. We approved the founding Russia-NATO Act. We adopted at the highest level the OSCE Declaration on the Indivisibility of Security in 1999 and in 2010. And beginning with 2015, we insisted on the unconditional implementation of the Minsk agreements, which emerged as a result of negotiations. And this is all fully in line with the Charter of the United Nations, which demands, I quote, to ensure conditions for the just and respect for obligations which emanate from treaties and other sources of international law, I quote. End of quote. And Western colleagues trampled upon this principle as well when they signed onto these documents, knowing in advance that they had no intention, would not comply with this. This has been repeatedly seen, and Mr. Putin referred to this repeatedly, including recently. And I'd like to remind the distinguished Secretary of State that President Zelenskyy signed a decree prohibiting the conduct of negotiations with the government of Putin. If the U.S. is so interested in them, I don't think it would be very difficult to give the command for the decree of Zelenskyy to be lifted. Now, in our Western opponents' rhetoric, we hear slogans, invasion, aggression, annexation, not a word about the root causes of the problems, where they cultivated and encouraged openly Nazi regimes, which openly rewrote the outcomes of the Second World War and the history of their own people. A substantive negotiation based on facts and respect for all of the requirements of the UN Charter is something which the West has avoided. And it seems that there is a fear of professional discussions that would reveal demagoguery with incantations of territorial integrity. Former colonial powers failed to mention the need for Paris to return the so-called French Mayotte and the composition of the islands, for London to withdraw from the Chagos archipelago, to begin discussions with Buenos Aires and the Malvinas Islands. These supporters of champions of territorial integrity in Ukraine now make it appear as if they don't even remember the sense of the Minsk agreements, which lies, I recall, in the reunification of Donbass and Ukraine, with a guarantee for respect for the fundamental human rights. First and foremost, the right to one's mother tongue. Having torn apart these agreements, the West now bears full responsibility for the collapse of Ukraine and for the fomenting of civil war there. Other principles in the Charter, respect for which could have prevented the security crisis in Europe, and could help to reach an agreement on the basis of balance of interest, I would mention Article 2 of Article 8, which sets out the need to develop the practice of peaceful resolution of dispute with the assistance of regional organizations. In line with this principle, the Russian Federation, together with our allies, has been consistently advocating the restoration of contacts between the Collective Security Treaty Organization, the CSTO, and NATO to facilitate the practical implementation of the above-mentioned outcomes of the OSCE Summit on the Indivisibility of Security, which stipulate, among other things, I quote, not a a single state, group of states, organization can be vested with primary responsibility for the maintenance of peace and security and stability in the OSCE region, or consider any part of that region as a sphere of influence, of its influence. It's clear to all that this is specifically what NATO was doing in its attempt to create a full superiority and in Europe and now in the Asia-Pacific. However, the repeated appeals of bodies of the CSTO to NATO were disregarded. The reason for such an arrogant position of the U.S. and their allies, as we see once again today, lies in an unwillingness to engage in any equitable dialogue with any party. If NATO had not rejected the proposal of the CSTO to cooperate, then perhaps we could have avoided numerous negative processes which resulted in the current European crisis, because Russia had been not listened to or deceived for decades. Today, at the proposal of the presidency, we are discussing effective multilateralism. Let us not forget the numerous facts of the genetic avoidance of the West of any forms of equitable cooperation. Consider Joseph Borrell's pearl, that Europe is a flourishing garden surrounded by jungles. This is purely neocolonialism with disregard for sovereign equality of states and the need to, and disregard for strengthening the principles of the UN through effective multilateralism. Trying to prevent democratization in international relations, the U.S. and its allies are openly and unceremoniously trying to privatize the Secretariat of the UN in circumvention of the Secretariat, trying to advance unconsensual mandates with claims to have the right to accuse those who, for one reason or another, are inconvenient to Washington. In this connection, let us recall the need for stringent compliance with the Charter, not just by member states, but also by the Secretariat of our organization. According to Article 100, the Secretariat has an obligation to act impartially and should not receive any instructions from any government. We have already talked about Article 2, and I wish to draw attention to a key point, paragraph 1, an organization based on the principles of sovereign equality of states. Building upon this principle, the General Assembly in the above-mentioned 1970 declaration reaffirmed, I quote, the inalienable right of each state to select for itself the political, economic, social, and cultural system without intervention from any side. End of quote. And in this connection, we have serious questions that arise about the statements which our distinguished Secretary General delivered on the 29th of March, that, and I quote, autocratic rule does not guarantee stability. This is a catalyst for chaos and conflict. And robust democratic societies are capable of correcting themselves, improving themselves. They can stimulate change, even radical change, without any bloodletting or violence. One cannot but recall the changes that were introduced by the aggressive misadventures of robust democracies in Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, and many others. The distinguished Secretary General then said, democracies are the centers of broad cooperation rooted in the principles of equality, participation, and solidarity. End of quote. Worthy of note is that this was all stated, this was all announced by something Biden convened beyond the outside of the framework of the UN, the so-called Summit for Democracy. The U.S. administration selected the participants of this on the principle of loyalty. Loyalty not so much for Washington, but rather the Democratic Party, which rules in Washington, attempts to use a new formula to address issues directly contradict paragraph 4, Article 1 of the UN Charter, which sets out the need, I quote, to ensure the role of the organization as a center for agreeing on action for the achievement of shared goals. Contrary to this principle, many years ago, France, Germany, they proclaimed an alliance of multilateralists, where they also invited only those who were obedient. And this in and of itself once again points to the unshakable nature of the colonialist mentality and the view of the initiators of this meeting vis-a-vis the principle of effective multilateralism. In parallel, there was a narrative that was imposed about the European Union as the ideal of multilateralism. Now there are calls from Brussels to expand the membership of the EU as soon as possible to include specifically the Balkan countries. But most importantly, importantly, it's not about Serbia, not about Turkey, where for decades hopeless talks have been carried out for their entry, but rather this is about Ukraine. Joseph Borrell recently said that the Kyiv regime needs to be accepted into the EU as soon as possible. Apparently, had it not been for the war, this would have taken years, and now there's a need to do so without respect for any criteria. Serbia, Turkey, and others, they'll wait, but the Nazis can skip the queue to enter the ranks of the EU. Incidentally, at the same Summit for Democracy, the Secretary General proclaimed that democracy emanates from the Charter of the United Nations. The first words of the Charter, "We the people," reflects a fundamental source of legitimacy, the consent of the governed. Quote. It is useful to compare this premise with the track record of the Kyiv regime, who, beginning with the coup in 2014 and the war being unleashed against its own people, against the millions of people who did not consent to rule by neo-Nazis and Russophobes, thereby undermining the territorial integrity of Ukraine. Those who, contrary to the Charter, divides humanity in democracies and autocracies, fail to respond to the question of what category they place the Ukrainian regime in. I won't wait for an answer. So there's a question about the relationship between the Security Council and the General Assembly. The Western aggressive clique has been peddling the theme of abuse of the right of veto, and not with an incorrect focus on members of the UN. They have reached the result. This was resulted in the situation that after every exercise of the veto, the General Assembly considers the matter. This is not a problem for us at all, because the Russian approaches to all issues on the agenda are open. There is does not pose a difficulty for us to expound on our positions or lay them out yet again. And the right to a veto is an absolutely legitimate instrument which is stipulated in the Charter of the United Nations to prevent the adoption of decisions that would divide the organization. But if the procedure for discussion of the General Assembly of applications of the veto was approved, since this was approved, then why not consider why certain resolutions without any veto that were adopted, including those many years ago, but are not being implemented, despite the provisions of Article 25 of the Charter? Why would the General Assembly not consider the reasons behind this? This includes resolutions of the Security Council of Palestine and the whole range of issues related to the Middle East, the JCPOA, Resolution 2202, which approved the Minsk agreements on Ukraine. Also worthy of attention is the problem linked to sanctions regimes. This is now a norm. The Security Council, after protracted negotiations, fully in line with the Charter, adopts sanctions against a specific country. Subsequently, the U.S. and its allies impose against that same state additional, supplemental, unilateral restrictions which did not secure the consent of the Security Council and are not included in its resolution as part of the agreed-upon package. This includes another very egregious example. Berlin, Paris, and London just adopted a decision through their national legislative bodies, for example, to extend restrictions against Iran that were set to expire in October, which are subject to legal conclusion in line with Resolution 2231. So the Security Council has determined that they have expired, but those countries decide on the rules. After this, any adoption of a council of sanctions, there is a need to consider the question of the adoption of any sanctions by the Security Council not be overridden by the desires of others. Also important is for sanctions regime through the Security Council to be time-bound insofar as their being unlimited in nature deprives the Council of flexibility vis-a-vis the impact on the sanctioned government's policy. There is a need to consider humanitarian limitations of sanctions. For sanctions projects introduced at the Security Council should be accompanied by assessments about their consequences through consequences by humanitarian agencies of the UN, rather than being accompanied by demagogical exhortations of Western colleagues that ordinary people will not suffer. We see a deep crisis in international relations, and the lack of willingness to redress this situation by the West. And the organization is responsible for the fate of the world in the historic context. There's a need to abandon parochial, short-sighted arrangements and national elections of any given member state being taken into account. Let us once again recall, nearly 80 years ago, having signed on to the UN Charter, world's leaders agreed to respect the sovereign equality of all states, large states, small states, poor ones, rich ones, monarchies, republics. In other words, even then, humankind recognized the need for equitable, polycentric world order as a guarantee for the sustainability and security of its development. For this reason, we're not talking today about subordinating ourselves to some kind of a rules-based order, but we are talking about compliance with all of the obligations which we shouldered when signing the Charter in all of their integral and interconnected nature. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency, Mr. Sergei Lavrov, and now I give the floor to Her Excellency, Mrs. Catherine Colonna, Minister of Foreign Affairs and Europe for the Republic of France.
Microphone, please. I thank the Secretary General for his remarks. I wish to take this opportunity to begin by applauding the statement delivered by the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelenskiy. For the past 18 months, he has been embodied Ukrainian action. He has been the countenance and the voice of millions of Ukrainian people who have been fighting for their freedom with admirable courage. Before this council, whose mandate focuses on international peace and security, his call is something which we need to respond to. On 24 February 2022, the Russian Federation chose to unleash a war of aggression against a sovereign state in violation of all its international commitments and principles, which for 8 decades have prevailed in relations among nations. A war with no other motivation than the Russian desire to restore its dream of an imperial past, despite the fact that this had been condemned by history. Ukraine is evidently the main victim of this war. Ukraine and its people every day endure atrocities, war crimes, shelling, torture. Ukrainian children, thousands of Ukrainian children have been forcefully abducted from their families and transferred to the Russian Federation. This is an abomination. Ukrainian women, men, children have endured mass rape, which has been used as a war crime, another crime. Yes, this war is a war against Ukraine, against the Ukrainian people, but this is also a war against the rules of international life. For this is a war against the most basic principles of our shared charter. First and foremost, the respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states. This is a war against the very idea of the United Nations. This is a war against the pillars of our collective security at a time when Russia has been harnessing the security of nuclear facilities as a leverage for the advancement of its aggression. This is a war against shared heritage of humankind, against cultural heritage, which Russia has been targeting in Odessa and elsewhere, targeting global food security with the sudden and cynical termination of the Black Sea Grain Initiative. And more than 270,000 tons of grains have been systematically destroyed by Russian bombardment For a member of this council to use hunger as a weapon is yet another transgression, following on a litany of others. And we need to consider the moral implications of this. This is a war which concerns all of us. For this reason, we will not waver. In the face of this aggression and the destabilization that it has generated throughout the world, only a handful of states, which states one should consider, support the catastrophic choice of Russia. The General Assembly, like the Security Council, are largely united around shared principles. How is it possible to position back-to-back the aggressor and the aggressed? This approach delivers neither peace nor justice nor stability. If we allow the Russian aggression to be rewarded today, let us not deceive ourselves. We will once again have to bring together the Security Council in this hall, for there will be other aggressions that will proliferate here and elsewhere, and nobody will be safe any longer. Mr. President, almost all countries present here at this table have, in their more or less recent history, endured the trauma of war. They experienced this firsthand, the destruction, the human tragedy which it carries in its wake, and they know that it is never a solution. Tomorrow, as is the case with every 21st of September, we commemorate the World Day of Peace. And we have a responsibility and a moral duty to act to end this aggression by Russia. The General Assembly, as and the AU, expressly call for. On 21 September, as has been the case every day since the outbreak of this war, France has been mobilized and will continue to mobilize to thwart this aggression for our common good. France will continue to act on the basis of shared principles. The principle of legitimate defense recognized by our charter. We will continue to pursue military and civil support and civilian support to provide Ukraine with what is necessary for it to resist the aggression. The principle of justice and dignity. We will continue to support Ukrainian and international jurisdictions to ensure that there is no impunity for crimes perpetrated by Russia. The principle of solidarity. We will continue to pursue and to step up our tangible support for the countries most hard hit by the global food crisis provoked by Russia. And we will step up our humanitarian assistance to benefit people in need throughout the world. Mr. President, the primacy of law over force, international solidarity, and support for the most vulnerable are principles which lie at the heart of President Zelenskyy's peace formula. This is why each day more and more of us support it. I call upon all states who have not yet done so to work to that end. Thank you.
I thank Her Excellency Madame Colonna for her statement. And I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Mauro Vieira, Minister for Foreign Affairs of the Federative Republic of Brazil.
I thank the Presidency of the Security Council for organizing this meeting. Mr. President, the conflict in Ukraine has added numerous stresses to the multilateral system, which was already subject to multiple complex challenges and increasing dissent. The current context of polarization and distrust does not create favorable conditions for the multilateral instances of international peace and security to operate effectively. The world is facing the highest number of violent conflicts since World War II, and 2 billion people, a quarter of humanity, are living in areas affected by conflicts. Yet, our collective institutions are not adequately responding to these challenges. As the concept note of this debate rightly points out, the inability of the Security Council to adequately fulfill its mandate is undermining its credibility and leading to renewed calls for its long overdue reform. In these troubled times, daunting violations of core values of the principles of the United Nations, Brazil has been encouraging member states to revive the spirit of San Francisco in the search for peace for present and future generations, which is the fundamental mission of this organization. Brazil fully respects and upholds the right of self-defense of all member states under Article 51 of UN Charter. At the same time, we must recognize that the recent escalation in the conflict, with the introduction of even more sophisticated weapons and ammunition, or the inadmissible threat of use of nuclear weapons, seriously undermines peace and security well beyond the battlefield, violating the core principles and provisions of the UN Charter. This dynamic has grave consequences, above all for the civilian population, in particular women and children, who are disproportionately affected by wars. The destruction of civilian infrastructure worsens the humanitarian crisis, especially as winter approaches. Moreover, the persistent threat to the integrity of nuclear facilities risks a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. Mr. President, as we have consistently noted, the war in Ukraine also affects other regions, especially as developing countries bear the burden of food and energy insecurity. We welcome the Secretary General's effort to explore alternatives to alleviate the suffering of millions of people who once again face hunger or the threat of hunger. Brazil strongly supports a resumption of the Black Sea Grain Initiative under terms that would be acceptable to all concerned parties. Brazil also underscores the need for addressing the root causes of food and energy insecurity, such as excessively high interest rates and external debt that severely impact prices and the ability of developing countries to invest in sustainable food and energy production. The current international financial structure is not well equipped to assist these countries address their major challenges. As recently announced by President Lula, Brazil will launch during our G20 presidency a global alliance against hunger. This is a top priority for Brazil and should be for all of us. Mr. President, it's worrisome that we are witnessing a conflict with such geopolitical reverberations well into the 21st century. We must reserve this course. We must reverse this course. Brazil, along with many others, continue to call for the de-escalation of hostilities, the resumption of dialogue, and a peaceful solution to the conflict. This is an obligation of all member states under Article 33 of the UN Charter. There is no military solution to this conflict, only a political solution that takes into account the purpose and principles of the UN Charter and the legitimate security concerns of all parties will bring lasting peace. The international community will have to assist the parties to come to a negotiated and lasting solution. Brazil is prepared to do its part. Mr. President, the space for diplomacy and peaceful solution is narrowing. We must set aside practices that only deepen divisions instead of contributing to a more peaceful world and work together for renewed multilateralism. Brazil firmly advocates for mediation and preventive diplomacy as indispensable tools to prevent the escalation of crisis. With this view, Brazil has been engaged in several fora to deal with the Ukrainian crisis. We have sent high representatives to Copenhagen and Jeddah. We have also spoken bilaterally to the concerned parties. We strongly encourage that in these conversations, both parties should be heard and their views carefully taken into consideration. Talking to only one part or the other will not help advancing the cause of durable peace. A comprehensive approach, as suggested, will be the only way forward to enable peaceful negotiations. With that in mind, we will organize next month, during our presidency of the Security Council, a high-level open debate on the contributions of regional, sub-regional, and bilateral arrangements to the prevention and peaceful resolution of disputes. I count on your participation in October. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Vieira for his statement, and now I give the floor to Her Excellency Mrs. Mariam Al-Mahiri, Minister of Climate Change and Environment, Chief of the International Affairs Office at the Presidential Court of the United Arab Emirates.
Thank you, Mr. President. I extend my gratitude to Secretary General Guterres for his valuable briefing and wish to acknowledge the heads of state and government and other high-level representatives present today. I also welcome the participation of President Zelensky. I commend Albania for convening this critical open debate. The UAE has long advocated for a peaceful resolution to the war in Ukraine that upholds the UN Charter. The war has wrought a devastating toll on human life, including the displacement of almost 2 out of every 3 children in Ukraine. The country now bears the grim record for the highest concentration of landmines in the world, rendering nearly 1/3 of the country no longer safe due to unexploded ordnance. This conflict has further ravaged food and transport infrastructure. We stress once again the need for all parties to comply with their obligations under international humanitarian law, and specifically the protection of those objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population. We are deeply concerned by the ramifications of the destruction of infrastructure on survivor services, health care, and other critical forms of support, especially on women and children, who already bear the brunt of armed conflict. The UAE has pledged $100 million to help address the humanitarian crisis. We have sent 11 airlifts of relief and medical supplies for children and the elderly, provided more than 2,500 generators, and sent 23 ambulances just this week. The UAE has also provided $4 million in funding for First Lady Olena Zelenskay's Foundation's programming for orphans. Beyond Ukraine, the war's global ripple effects are evident, especially in the pronounced impact on food security, including in our own region. Let me restate that the UAE remains steadfast in supporting the renewal of the Black Sea Grain Initiative and the full implementation of the MOU on Russian fertilizers and food products, as well as any discussions that support these goals. Mr. President, while crucial, these measures only alleviate rather than end suffering. World leaders, especially this week in the General Assembly, have made clear the global desire for a just and sustainable peace in Ukraine, one that upholds the UN Charter. A diverse set of countries is increasingly coming together around the common cause of peace in Ukraine. We welcome the role played by countries such as the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and China, as well as the African Peace Initiative, in supporting all possible routes to a peaceful settlement. In these calls, there is growing recognition of the urgency of the task, not just for Ukraine, but for all of us. The war amplified the erosion of faith in multilateralism. Achieving peace can begin its restoration. Of course, peace will only come out of diplomatic talks between Russia and Ukraine, and it will only be just and sustainable if it upholds the UN Charter. The UN Security Council and its members have a vital role to play in this process. We can encourage and incentivize de-escalation, extend the urgency to uphold the UN Charter to every file before us, and expand the circle of peacemakers to reflect today's global realities. We would welcome an increasingly representative council and believe the discussions on Security Council reform should move forward with serious intention. Though the path to peace in Ukraine may be arduous, it doesn't license inaction. There is only one sustainable path to a just and lasting peace in Ukraine, in line with the UN Charter and preserving its sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity, and the UAE stands ready to support that objective. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Her Excellency, Ms. Almairi, for her statement, and I give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Ma Jiaosu, Executive Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs of the People's Republic of China.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, China's position on the Ukraine issue is consistent and clear. President Xi Jinping put forward 4 points on what must be done, 4 things the international community must do together, and 3 observations. They have become fundamental guidance for China to handle the Ukraine issue. We believe that the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of all countries should be respected. The purposes and the principle of the UN Charter observed. The legitimate security concerns of all countries taken seriously, and all efforts conducive to resolving the crisis supported. In February this year, we released China's position on the political settlement of the Ukraine crisis, laying out 12 propositions, including respecting sovereignty, ceasing hostilities, resuming talks, stopping unilateral sanctions, etc. The core message is facilitating talks for peace. China has maintained close communication on the Ukraine crisis with various relevant parties and the rest of the international community. The Special Representative of the Chinese government on Eurasian affairs has visited countries concerned and attended the International Conference on Ukraine in Jeddah. China has facilitated talks for peace in its own way and played a positive and constructive role in resolving the Ukraine crisis. Mr. President, the Ukraine crisis is still on. The intense situation on the battleground and the accumulating risks of spillover have exerted a significant impact internationally. The Ukraine crisis has become what it is today for a variety of deep and complex reasons. A prolonged and expanded Ukraine crisis is in no one's interest. In light of the current situation, I would like to stress on the following 4 points. First, stay committed to facilitating talks for peace. History has proven that conflict produces no winner and war cannot solve problems. The pursuit of one's absolute security, all efforts to stoke bloc confrontation will only intensify disagreement and conflict and will come to no good. However complicated the situation or challenging the task, it is important to stick to the general direction of political settlement, help parties concerned to build consensus, initiate talks for peace, and cease hostilities at an early date. To this end, the international community needs to create necessary conditions and atmosphere. Relevant parties need to take a long view, uphold the vision of common, comprehensive, cooperative, and sustainable security, respect each other's legitimate security concerns, and promote the building of a balanced, effective, and sustainable security architecture in Europe. Second, avoid pouring oil over the fire. All parties should exercise restraint and not increase or escalate tension. Refrain from taking any initiatives that lead to a steady escalation of the situation, and work to create necessary conditions for political settlement. We should safeguard the bottom line of nuclear security and prevent man-made nuclear accident. Third, manage the spillover risks. The Ukraine crisis has dealt a heavy blow toward economic recovery and global development, and severely affected the world food, energy, and financial security. Developing countries are the first to bear the brunt. Relevant countries should stop abusing unilateral sanctions and long-arm jurisdiction and protect the security and the smooth operation of global production and supply chains. We support relevant parties in maintaining communication with Russia and Ukraine on the bloc the Black Sea Green Deal and assuming the deal on the basis of balanced consideration of the concerns of both sides with a view to earnestly protecting global food security. Fourth, ease the humanitarian crisis. In 2023, as many as 339 million people around the world are in need of humanitarian aid, some 70 million more than at the beginning of 2022. The Ukraine crisis has produced millions of displaced people and destroyed multiple important large-scale infrastructure. The parties to the conflict should strictly observe international humanitarian law, follow the principles of necessity, distinction, and proportionality, protect civilians and civilian infrastructure, and provide rapid, safe, and unimpeded humanitarian access in order to lessen the suffering of civilians. The international community and the humanitarian institutions should honor the principles of humanitarian aid and step up efforts to help people affected, tide over difficulties. China attaches great importance to the humanitarian situation in Ukraine. At the beginning of the crisis, we put forward a 6-point initiative for preventing a massive humanitarian crisis and have all along played a constructive role in easing the humanitarian situation. We have provided multiple batches of humanitarian supplies to Ukraine. Mr. President, China will stay committed to the true multilateralism, stay committed to an objective and just position, and will always stand on the side of dialogue, on the side of peace, and on the right side of history. We are ready to work with Security Council members and relevant parties to continue playing a constructive role for the political settlement of the Ukraine crisis. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Your Excellency, Mr. Ma, for your statement. And now I give the floor to representatives of Mozambique.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I wish to thank the Albanian Presidency for convening this briefing. We also wish to express our deep gratitude to the Secretary General for his invaluable insights. Mr. President, it is not redundant that we remind ourselves of the importance of multilateralism, fostering cooperation, partnership, interaction between states based on a shared system of norms and values. Multilateralism also involves consultation, dialogue, inclusion, respect, solidarity, and is guided by collectively developed rules that ensure sustainable and effective cooperation. More significantly, the importance of multilateralism lies in its ability to enable us, sovereign states, to solve complex challenges collectively that they could be not overcome individually. By nurturing peace before, during, and after conflicts, multilateralism contributes to sustainable and lasting peace. It is in this regard that the Security Council must play its crucial role in maintaining international peace and security by facilitating political process, protecting civilians, preventing wars, promoting human rights, and restoring the rule of law. Mr. President, this protracted conflict between Russia and Ukraine constitutes a grave risk to the maintenance of global peace and security. This, in essence, perfectly illustrates the struggle multilateralism faces. Despite numerous international appeals, including from this very Council, we are now entering the 574th day of hostilities with mounting civilian casualties and no clear end in sight. It is indeed a 21st century tragedy unfolding under our collective gaze and the scrutiny of the entire world. This conflict unfolds both on the battlefield and amidst a perplexed and divided public opinion, pushing our contemporary multilateral system to its breaking point. Our multilateral system, as we all can attest, has, despite its imperfections, weathered numerous crises. These ongoing crises pose a serious threat to this foundational principle of global stability. Not only has the conflict caused immense suffering for Ukraine and its people, but it has also compounded global food security issues, pushing more individuals into poverty and destabilizing regions far from the conflict's epicenter. Moreover, this conflict impedes our joint efforts to reach vital multilateral milestones like the Sustainable Development Goals, which are a focal topic of this year's General Assembly, and jeopardizes our collective efforts toward non-proliferation. Mr. President, of particular concern to Mozambique is the intensification of military rhetoric and the possibility of further escalation. It is evident that the involved parties continue to prioritize military strategies over dialogue and compromise, increasing the risk of severe miscalculations. We maintain that there can be no purely military resolution to this crisis. Should one be pursued, it will weigh heavily on the Council's conscience for a generation to come. We remain unyielding in our advocacy for a political and negotiated end to this conflict. We once again urge all parties to silence the guns, engage in earnest in diplomatic efforts aimed at the swift resumption of direct negotiations. A lasting peace, consistent with the Charter, remains the sole viable solution. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Mozambique, and now I give the floor to His Excellency, the Chancellor of Germany, Mr. Scholz.
Mr. President, colleagues, excellencies, it has been almost 19 months since Russia started a brutal war of aggression against its sovereign neighbor, Ukraine. Tens of thousands of soldiers and Ukrainian civilians have been killed. Countless Ukrainian children have been abducted. Russian troops have murdered, raped, and tortured. They are razing towns and villages to the ground. They are mining entire regions, turning cornfields into death traps. This war is taking place in Europe, but its repercussions are felt throughout the world. Russia has deliberately removed millions of tons of grains and fertilizer from the world market, which countries around the globe need to guarantee food security. Russia is deliberately targeting grain silos and port infrastructures. And Russia has withdrawn unilaterally from the Black Sea Grain Initiative, triggering more poverty and more food insecurity all over the world. There is no justification for that. Any claims that sanctions are hampering Russian exports of crops and fertilizer are false. There are no sanctions impeding such exports. On the contrary, Russia dominates the global fertilizer market. 2022 was a record year for Russian wheat exports. The reason for the continued suffering in Ukraine and around the world is shockingly simple. Russia's president wants to follow through with his imperialistic plan to conquer his sovereign neighbor, Ukraine. Mr. President, the United Nations has expressed very clearly what it thinks of Russia's war of aggression, most recently on the 23rd of February of this year. The General Assembly called for just and lasting peace. This demand is directed at Russia. It remains unanswered. Nothing rings out louder today than Russia's silence in response to this global call for peace. Some argue that this war could have been prevented by diplomatic means. In fact, France and Germany have held hundreds of meetings with Moscow and Kiev since the beginning of Russia's attack on eastern Ukraine in 2014. Our aim was to find a diplomatic solution that is in line with international law. All these endeavors failed because one party, Russia, chose war over diplomacy. But there has been no lack of diplomatic efforts. Some call for immediate ceasefire. I acknowledge their good intentions. We all want an end to the killing today rather than tomorrow. And yet we must beware of seemingly easy solutions that promise peace in name only. Peace without freedom is oppression, and peace without justice is a dictate. In the resolutions of the General Assembly, we have laid out the path towards peace. Peace means respecting the UN Charter. Peace means respecting the territorial integrity and political independence of Ukraine. That is the promise of UN Charter gives to every United Nations member state. No one longs for peace more than the Ukrainians. The peace plan that the Ukrainian President has laid out is proof of that. The recent meetings in Copenhagen and Jeddah were important. This work should be continued. It should be continued in the pursuit of one goal, finding peace that respects the principles of the UN Charter. Mr. President, the more decisively we rally behind these principles, the more determined we are in pushing for a just peace, and the more united we are in our rejections of Russian aggression, the sooner this war will end. The sooner this human suffering will end in Ukraine and around the world. This goal is worth our utmost efforts. Thank you.
I thank the Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany, His Excellency Mr. Olaf Scholz. There are still a considerable number of speakers remaining on my list for this meeting, so I intend, with concurrence of members of the Council, to suspend the meeting until 15:30 or 3:30 p.m. for our American friends. So the meeting is suspending.